Welcome back everyone, I'm Aric from Rayquaza, and today I'm going to be giving you my full set review of the latest Pokemon TCG expansion, Sword and Shield Evolving Skies. And man, this looks to be a pretty wild set, partially because of how absurdly expensive some of these cards are looking to be. Yes, I am looking at you, Rayquaza VMAX and Eeveelution Full Arts. But also because Evolving Skies finally marks the return of Dragon-type Pokemon back into the Pokemon TCG. They've been missing ever since the beginning of the Sword and Shield era, and they are finally back, sporting a few minor tweaks to both their new card design templates and their gameplay, most notably with their new lack of a weakness going forward. And as usual with most of our international set releases, Evolving Skies primarily is pulling its cards from a variety of existing Japanese sets, most notably the Eevee Heroes, Skystream, and Towering Perfection sets, plus actually a handful of cards from some older sets that were previously unreleased before now. Now, unfortunately, a handful of important cards are going to be skipping this release once again, like the Inteleon and Gengar VMAX high class decks, but Evolving Skies still has a ton of new Pokemon V and VMAX for us to talk about today. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the yearly summer rotation is happening basically right after Evolving Skies drops. So for this set review, all of the discussion and my ratings today are going to be viewed through the lens of the upcoming post-rotation format, as I think that's mainly the context you guys are probably thinking about these cards in. And on that note, just a quick plug, if you guys are thinking about picking up any cards from Evolving Skies, whether it's singles, sealed product, or maybe some other cards for the post-rotation format, you can check out our friends at flipsidegaming.com. You can use the coupon code RARECANDY at checkout to save some money on your order. And all of our patrons actually have their own exclusive discount code for even bigger savings. Or on the other hand, you can check out our friends at tcgplayer.com if Flipside is out of stock of what you're looking for, or if you're just maybe a little bit more familiar with TCG Player. I have an affiliate link down below in the description you guys can use if you are looking to pick up some stuff. And even though there's no discount code attached to the link, TCG Player always finds you the cheapest prices online for what you might be looking for. But if you guys want an easier way at showing your support, you guys can always just crush that like button. It lets me know you enjoy this style of content and also does help get this video seen by more people, helping me beat my arch nemesis, the pesky YouTube algorithm. And while you're down there too, make sure you are subscribed with those notifications turned on. That way you will stay up to date whenever my next Evolving Skies videos start to drop. But with all that out the way, let's head into the actual set review. I've got timestamps pinned to the top of the comment section. That way you guys can jump to any card you might want to hear about in the review today. So make sure to sit back, relax, and let's check out what Evolving Skies has in store for us. Alrighty guys, to kick things off, we have a new Pinsir card that's going to be a single strike Pokemon, and its ability says damage from your single strike Pokemon's attacks is not affected by resistance. Then it just has kind of a vanilla attack, 2 grass and a colorless for 110. Probably never going to use this, but of course the ability is going to be the real point of discussion here. So effectively in certain matchups, this reads plus 30 damage for your single strike Pokemon. So while I do like that this is effectively a searchable damage buff for your single strike Pokemon, I definitely have some pretty big reservations when it comes to Pinsir. So one of them is that a lot of the single strike Pokemon require the Houndoom engine to get up and running to accelerate energy. And in my experience, that usually drastically limits your bench space, because typically these types of decks want around 2, maybe 3 Houndoom in play, 2 attackers, and then usually 1, sometimes 2 flexible bench spots for support Pokemon, such as Crobat. So while this actually would help single strike Urshifu VMAX go through the resistance on Shadow Rider Calyrex, I do worry about actually having the bench space to accommodate Pinsir. So at that point, I'm kind of left wondering, what decks might even want something like Pinsir? I think it's really just going to come down to single strike Pokemon that aren't reliant on something like the Houndoom engine to get up and running. So think of a card like Beedrill back from Chilling Reign. This is actually kind of a half decent example where Beedrill's second attack actually can't even 2-shot a Zacian V because of resistance. A card like Pinsir suddenly makes Beedrill a much better attacker against decks that aren't playing special energy. Or also think of another single prize card like Lycanroc. That's a card that only really needs like maybe 1 Houndoom in play at a time to get up and running, freeing up some bench space for Pinsir and being able to discard it in the matchups that you don't need it in. Now, of course, you can probably already see the flaw here is that we're talking about cards that really have had no real impact on the game competitively up until this point. So, I mean, I definitely think there is a world where Pinsir could see play at some point in his lifespan. You know, we've seen other cards over the years like Magnetic Storm see play because of this same exact type of effect. Being able to eliminate resistance sometimes is the difference between a 1-shot and a 2-shot, or a 2-shot and a 3-shot. So, I mean, it's really not bad, but I just don't see the application for something like this. So needless to say, guys, I'm going to pass on Pinsir for the moment, but this is a card I actually probably would still keep one of just for when the time is right. You never know what other single strike cards are coming down the pipeline. And if there is a pretty decent one that is resisted by a couple of prominent cards in the metagame, Pinsir definitely could easily pop up as a theoretical one of. So I think it's a bad card for the moment, but that definitely is subject to change at some point. So we're going to be taking a look at a Jumpluff evolution line. This is going to be a new Rapid Strike evolution line. And before we do look at Jumpluff, we do need to briefly highlight Skiploom. I think this ability is actually really, really good. It says once during your turn, when you attach an energy from your hand to this Pokemon, you may search your deck for a card that evolves from this Pokemon. Play it on this Pokemon to evolve it, and shuffle your deck. And with Jumpluff being a stage 2, this is a fantastic ability. Stage 2s really have been in a bad spot for a long time, and any help they can get to get set up more consistently is definitely going to be welcome. But taking a look at Jumpluff, has 90 HP, which is fantastic, of course. That makes this entire evolution line searchable by level ball. But it has this ability: this Pokemon may attack twice a turn. If the first attack knocks out your opponent's active, you may attack again after your opponent chooses a new active Pokemon. So this is basically like the old Omega Barrage ancient trait, but in the form of an ability now. And then Jumpluff has one attack here, just for a grass energy, does a vanilla 60. But of course, guys, we do have to remember we can attack twice, meaning that effectively this is 1 for 120 if you want to think about it that way. So I have to say, I think rating this card was a little bit difficult for me because I actually really do like a lot of things about this card. The free retreat, the low HP, making it level ball searchable, being a Rapid Strike card, great ability. But I just really worry about this card's potential damage output. You know, its built-in attack is not too great. So I think if we ever really want to build around this card, we're going to have to really take a look at the other Rapid Strike tool cards that are in the format, just to give Jumpluff some potentially other decent attacks to make use of. After Evolving Skies drops, we will have technically 3 different Rapid Strike scroll cards to make use of. But my issue with that whole strategy is that they all kind of have clunky, awkward attack costs that can be very difficult to power up in a single turn. And when you're having to fall back on this built-in attack to Jumpluff, you're kind of in a bad spot. Now, while we're on the subject of tool cards, I actually do think that is one thing I do like about Jumpluff, is the fact that some of the gloves tool cards that we've seen are actually a little bit better than normal with a card like Jumpluff. So typically they're going to have you do 30 more damage to the type that corresponds to them, which already on its own is okay. But when you're attacking twice, suddenly these other glove cards that we're seeing, including the new ones coming out in this set, are now effectively doing plus 60 in a turn. That's actually kind of impressive. So maybe even the idea for this Jumpluff is you just run Jumpluff and a bunch of these glove tool cards to effectively do 180 every time you attack, no matter the deck you're going against. So, which might even open up an opportunity for something like the new Medicham V to come in and basically just have a deck that's based around cheating extra turns and extra attacks, because Medicham kind of fills that same sort of role there by giving you an extra turn if you're able to knock something out with its attack. So I think this evolution line is really, really cool, guys, and Skiploom is definitely a card to keep an eye on no matter what, just in case we do get even more Jumpluffs. But right now, I think Jumpluff is just a little bit too underpowered. It's built-in attack a little bit weaker than I would like, and all of the different scroll cards, like I mentioned, are going to be a little bit awkward to get powered up. So unfortunately, I think I am going to pass on Jumpluff, but I really do like this evolution line, and maybe down the road things will change. Maybe we'll get a really broken scroll card to play with this. But for the moment, I think this thing is just a little bit shy of where it needs to be in terms of power. So up next, we have our very first Pokemon VMAX of the set review, and that is going to be Leafeon VMAX. And so before we get to the VMAX, I actually do think Leafeon V is pretty important for this conversation. So Leafeon V, we're mainly taking a look at for its ability. Once per turn, you may switch your deck for a grass energy and attach it to one of your Pokemon. If you use this ability, your turn ends. So I think this is actually a very, very good ability. You know, Leafeon has a somewhat manageable 2 attack cost, and being able to cheat an extra energy in play in the early portions of the game is really good and might prevent you from being forced to run something like Rillaboom to keep your Leafeons chugging along for the rest of the game. So I really do like this ability on Leafeon a lot. But looking at Leafeon VMAX, 310 HP, fire weakness, 2 retreat cost, and I think the main attack we're really focusing in on here is going to be Grass Knot. Does 60 for each energy and your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. Then its other attack for 2 grass and a colorless does 170, and you heal 30 from this Pokemon. So even though we are losing Absol in the rotation, we do have Galar Mine still, which is going to be sort of the main sort of combo card to increase our opponent's retreat cost. So on average, if our opponent has a retreat cost of 2, which I do think is pretty common right now, Galar Mine is going to give them effectively a 4 retreat, making Grass Knot do 240 for 2, which honestly isn't that bad. Now, unfortunately, tag teams are rotating, meaning that there's not too many Pokemon you can like push your damage up high enough to one-shot with this thing, making, I think, Leafeon a slightly worse attacker in the post-rotation format as opposed to the pre-rotation one. But even still, this is pretty decent damage to energy ratio that we're talking about here. And even though this is like kind of comparable to other cards like Eternatus that have a very similar energy to damage ratio, playing Galar Mine in your deck already kind of naturally makes things a little bit more awkward for your opponent throughout the course of a game as well. So yeah, even though Eternatus I think is probably going to be a little bit more consistent, has probably a few more attacking options, and is a little bit more proven up until this point, being able to do roughly the same amount of damage while also disrupting your opponent's retreating methods is definitely something that is kind of nice. It is worth pointing out all of the Eeveelutions in this set also do have their own accompanying tool card that does benefit them. In the case of the one for Leafeon, we have a tool card that will actually eliminate its weakness and retreat cost, which is pretty cool because if you have your Galar Mine in play and your Leafeon has a 4 retreat, you can just slap down your tool card, have free retreat, and get rid of your weakness, which is actually pretty cool because in the post-rotation format, we no longer have weakness card energy. We also, of course, still have things like Tool Scrapper and Tool Jammer to get rid of things like Air Balloon if your opponent tries to reduce their own retreat cost to counter your Galar Mine. So I think there are some cool things going on for Leafeon here, both in terms of the VMAX and the base form Leafeon V as well. Now, as I already mentioned, guys, we do have other Pokemon VMAX that do very similar amounts of damage for very similar amounts of energy, such as Eternatus and Ice Rider Calyrex. So we'll have to see where Leafeon VMAX is going to land. I really do like Leafeon V. And even though I think the second attack on Leafeon VMAX is largely kind of inconsequential, I do like this first attack. And I think it's probably one of the better Eeveelution VMAXs we're going to be taking a look at in this set review. So up next from there, we have another Grass VMAX that is going to be a Trevenant VMAX. So there is a Trevenant V coming out in the set, which honestly isn't anything too special, but it does have a second attack that can discard a card from your opponent's hand, but nothing really too crazy to write home about. But Trevenant VMAX, its first attack for a Grass Colorist is 40 for each supporter card in your opponent's discard pile. Its other attack for 2 Grass and a Colorist does a flat 180. Its first attack kind of reminds me of the old Trashlanch Garbodor back from Guardians Rising. You know, that card's damage output was based on item cards in your opponent's discard pile, whereas this is supporters, so that honestly, unfortunately, does make a pretty big difference, but a very similar sort of feel here. I do think this being supporters is a little bit worse, though, just because I think on average, a lot of decks right now are playing probably like 11 supporters total, like 3 boss, 4 research, 4 Marnie, something like that. And, you know, your opponent's not always going to have all of those in the discard pile. And a lot of decks right now have alternate draw engines, too, to not have to rely so heavily on these physical supporters. Think of the new Rayquaza VMAX, Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX, Eternatus VMAX. So I'm actually kind of skeptical of how good this attack is ever really going to be until maybe like the last turn of the game. I will say this though, luckily its second attack hitting for a flat 180 really isn't as bad as it seems. 180 is actually a really good 2-shotting number that we have here. And we can also one-shot some of the basic Pokemon V like Eldegoss, Crobat, and Galarian Moltres. So honestly, not too bad in that regard. But in order to get this set up, you're going to have to run something like a Rillaboom engine or Rose. And the energy acceleration engines you have to use to get this thing powered up, I think are too clunky relative to how strong this card is. Like maybe if these attacks were a bit crazier, I might jump through the extra hoops to play like a stage 2 or this weird supporter acceleration engine, but these are pretty average attacks. And I think other VMAXs can do very similar amounts of damage most of the time for a lot less effort expended in the process. So even though I think Trevenant is honestly a pretty average serviceable card, I currently don't really see the case to be made to play this over other VMAXs that can play the 2-shot game much more efficiently, much more consistently. It's honestly not a bad card. It's just kind of outclassed, I think, compared to some of the other stuff in format. Next up, we have another evolution that is going to be Flareon VMAX here. This is going to be a single strike evolution line, and there is a Flareon V, though it's not going to be in this set. It will be released in some other products around a similar time frame as the new Evolving Skies set. Nothing too special about it, but I do want to highlight that Flareon V does have an attack that can accelerate fire energy, so that is at least worth highlighting. But of course, Flareon VMAX is going to be kind of the star of the show here. Just has one attack for a fire and 2 colorless is 100. You discard the top 5 cards of your deck, and this attack does 100 damage for each energy card you discarded in this way. So this attack definitely has the potential to be pretty insane, doing theoretically up to 500 damage, excluding single strike energies from Houndooms and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty cool, but as you can tell by my rating, I think that's going to be a little bit tricky for Flareon. And really the main reason for that is that you have to play so many energies in your deck to be able to count on being able to take one shots with this thing. Because really, at the end of the day, you just need 3 energy to discard. Because after your single strike energies kick in, you know, that basically one shots any VMAX in the format. So if you want to discard 3 cards, you're probably going to need help from something like a Rangaroo to at least guarantee 1 energy. And then from there, you just need 2 more, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but you really do need like 20, 30 energy in your deck to really guarantee that sort of damage output consistently. And that's where I really do start to lose interest, because even though it's possible, I mean, you're sacrificing so much consistency to be able to ensure that you're doing decent damage with this thing. Now, I will say in the late game, I do like Flareon a good bit better, because at that point, you've probably gone through a lot of your Pokemon that you need, a lot of your trainer cards, and between things like Energy Recycler or the new Volcarona V even, there are some ways that stacking your deck full of energy in the late game, making this attack a little bit stronger then. So I do think there's actually plenty of support for Flareon. I mean, we have things like Earn a Vitality to get back your single strike energies you might discard. We have Energy Recycler and Volcarona V, like I already mentioned, to get back your fire energies. We have Houndoom to get Flareon powered up, even though we've lost Welder. We have a Ranger to stack your deck, but again, I just don't think your draw and setup engine is going to be strong enough given how much of it you're going to have to hollow out to make room for all of your evolutions and the energy that you're going to need for this deck. Alrighty guys, so next up we have a new Entei, and this is actually going to be a single strike card. It's a basic Pokemon with 2 attacks, the first of which for a fire and colorless does 10 more damage for each damage counter on all of your benched single strike Pokemon. And its other attack for 2 fire and a colorless does 120, and this Pokemon does 30 damage to itself. Now 120 is fine and all, but I think the first attack here is definitely going to be the more interesting of the 2 attacks. So I think at a glance, this attack seems like it has actually a pretty big damage ceiling, because if you have a couple of maybe single strike Urshifu VMAX or maybe a Volcanion V or something like that on the bench that was able to sustain a hit, you can kind of come in with Entei, capitalize on your opponent not taking a one shot, and theoretically do a ton of damage with just this little single prize Pokemon. Now, I think one of the issues that Entei has, of course, is the fact that your opponent can just boss up these things on your bench. And whenever they do that, they can eliminate a ton of damage that your Entei would be able to use. In addition to that, I think just getting the damage on your Pokemon sometimes can be a little bit tricky. Now, of course, we do have Houndoom, but Houndoom most of the time is going to be using its ability to power up whatever attacker you need in a turn, and probably is going to be able to set up too many additional attachments on other bench Pokemon. There are, of course, things like Spike Myth and Old Cemetery to maybe help with things a little bit more. But overall, purposefully trying to set up damage on your board seems a little bit clunky for my liking. And also, I think there is the other issue, being that Entei is a fire Pokemon and needs fire energy specifically in its attack cost. Of course, guys, if we're playing single strike Pokemon, we really want them to be dark or fighting, just because those are the types that single strike energy will cover. And so as you can tell by my rating, I just think this attack is like kind of awkward. You know, if Entei ever does see play, I think it would be as a one-of in single strike decks that are playing Aurora and or Impact Energy in addition to their single strike energies. But even that's something I'm not sold on. So yeah, gonna pass on this one. Next up, we have Victini. Victini is going to be a basic Pokemon here with just 1 attack for 2 colorless energy, does 30, and you may search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So honestly, if you are going second on your first turn, this is really not too hateful of an attack to use. Being able to just slap down a Twin Energy do 30 damage, and grab 2 cards to set up your next turn. Definitely seems appealing to me. You know, if you're playing Twin Energy already, that means more than likely you're playing some sort of single prize, probably evolution based deck. And so maybe if you are playing something like that, you can use this to grab one of your evolutions in a rare candy, or whatever it might be. It could be supporters for the next turn to help get set up a little bit better as well. And even though you can easily search this out with Level Ball, even though you can power it up with other things like Turbo Patch on the first turn, the big reason this card is bad is because of Marnie. You know, Marnie is a 3 to 4 of in most decks out there. And so very frequently, you're just going to use this attack, do 30 damage. Your opponent's going to Marnie you, then knock out your Victini. And suddenly you've played a Victini, a Twin Energy, and wasted all of this deck space for nothing. Because really after the first turn of the game, I think a card like this becomes much weaker as you get later into the game. This is a good attack to set up your hand for the next turn. But really after turn 2, you really don't want to be attacking with stuff like this anymore. And I think at that point, I would just almost rather play Snorlax. I think Snorlax is going to be generally a little bit more splashable because it doesn't rely on any specific type of energy to use its ability. And also in the case of Snorlax, you don't have to waste energy on that. You can actually start attaching to your primary attackers in a game. So that way, even if you do get Marnie, it's not like you're wasting resources into a Pokemon that's not really giving you any value. So yeah, I think this card is a pass. It's not really an awful card. It's just definitely released into the wrong point in the Pokemon TCG. So gonna pass on this one. So next up we have a Volcarona V. We briefly touched on this one already when discussing Flareon VMAX, but this is a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, water weakness, a 2 retreat, and has 2 attacks. I think definitely the first one is going to be a little bit better, especially now that we have lost Welder. But for a single fire energy, just 20, plus 20 more for each basic energy card in your discard pile, then shuffle those cards into your deck. So if this sounds familiar, it probably should, because this is actually very similar to Victini Prism Star, which actually did see a fair bit of play when it was legal. And the reason Victini saw play in decks like Blacephalon and Ability Zard is because they played a very high count of basic energies. Most decks, if they are playing basic energies, it's going to be somewhere between 8 to 12. And decks like that, I think it's really hard to get good value out of an attack like this. But in those decks where they're playing almost close to 20 energy sometimes, yeah, this becomes a much better style of attack. And looking to the early days of the post-rotation format, I'm not really seeing a whole lot that would really benefit from Volcarona V. Now, it's important to note that this does not specify basic fire energy, so that means, yes, we can use this even with something like the new Rayquaza VMAX, or really any other deck that might play Aurora Energy or some counts of fire energy in their list. But I think if this card does see any play, it will be with Flareon VMAX. But of course, as you just saw when I talked about Flareon, I'm really not very convinced of the Flareon archetype as a whole, meaning that Volcarona V is kind of left without a home for the moment, if I have to say so. I mean, this could definitely change, as Victini Prism Star was kind of in a similar boat when it released. It didn't really have a great partner at the time, but as we got more and more sets added to the card pool afterwards, it finally found a home and a couple of different fire archetypes out there. So the same definitely could be said of Volcarona V. I think this is a solid attack. But unfortunately, to do any real substantial amount of damage with this, you have to be playing it in a deck that is playing a ton of energy already. And unfortunately, I just don't see a very competitive one right now for Volcarona to call its own. Next up, we're going to take a look at Gyarados VMAX. And guys, I almost feel like Gyarados has kind of been given the same treatment as Charizard over the past several years, where, you know, creatures and Pokemon, they just design these Gyarados cards to hit like super hard and have like kind of like shock value built into its attack cost and damage, but the cards themselves usually wind up being like super mediocre, and that's kind of what we have here yet again. But before we get to the VMAX, I do want to point out actually Gyarados V has an interesting attack that we could come back to. So for 2 water and a colorless is 20 times the amount of damage counters on this Pokemon. While I don't think that's incredibly important on its own, we do have to remember we do have Memory Capsule on the format to potentially reuse that attack with Gyarados VMAX if we choose to. But the actual VMAX here, 330 HP, Lightning Weakness, and 4 Retreat cost. And its first attack for 2 water and a colorless is 120, and you discard an energy attached to your opponent's active. And its other attack for 3 water and a colorless does a flat 240. Now I'll say the one thing that is like kind of synergistic about these attacks is that between both of them, you can 2-shot VMAXs. The 120 is going to come in, soften your opponent up, maybe discard an energy, make it a little bit tougher for them to cobble together their attack. The next turn, all you need is 1 more single energy, and you can finish the job. So they actually do pair a little bit nicely with each other, but I actually do like the idea of potentially using Temper Tantrum with Memory Caps. I think that might give Gyarados a much heavier hitting attack for the same attack cost as Hyper Beam here. So, as long as your opponent is not playing a deck that can take one-shots on Gyarados, Temper Tantrum is usually going to do a pretty beefy amount of damage. So as long as you have 16 to 17 damage counters on your Gyarados already, you can pretty much one-shot anything in the game, which isn't too bad, I have to say. But I think right now, water Pokemon have a lot of competition for what might be the best Frostmoth partner or the best Melanie partner. Of course, Ice Rider Calyrex VMAX is going to be the big one that comes to mind for a pretty good reason. It can hit above 200 damage for just 2 attachments, whereas Gyarados is going to need 4 and probably a stage 1 to help it do so. Then we do still have some other older Pokemon VMAX like Inteleon that also kind of play the 2-shot game, but I think are generally a little bit more versatile since they can do bench damage. And we have other one-shot machines in the format like Lapras as well still. And then on top of that, we have the new Eeveelutions coming out in this same set as well that we're going to be talking about shortly. So I think Gyarados has a little bit too much competition given how average its attacks are. So I will say, I think you can build a functioning Gyarados VMAX deck. We've seen VMAX is paired with Frostmoth, so that's not really the issue. I just kind of think this card gets outshined by some of the other stuff we talked about. And also, I will point out, it is weak to Lightning. Even though Pikarom is going to be leaving the format, we are getting Flaffy in the same set, which of course is going to open up a lot more potential for Lightning Pokemon going forward that Gyarados might have to worry about. So yeah, unfortunately, if you were hoping for a very competitive Gyarados VMAX, you did not get your wish. Next up, we have another Gen 1 Pokemon VMAX that we're going to be taking a look at. That, of course, is going to be Vaporeon VMAX. For just a single colorless energy, it says put 1 Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench, then attach up to 3 water energy from your discard pile to that Pokemon. And its other attack for a water and 2 colorless is 100, plus 100 more if your opponent's active already has any damage counters on it. So even though I think a lot of people's attention might go to this first attack, I debatably think this is maybe the less impactful of the two. So while I actually think this is a pretty cool attack, and it's pretty interesting because you can grab even stage 1 Pokemon, Pokemon VMAX, stage 2 Pokemon, and immediately get them into play, I think this attack might be slightly too slow, I hate to say. Like, this is really the type of attack I would like to use on the base form Vaporeon V when I'm still trying to get set up. But once you've evolved into your VMAX, at that point you really want to start attacking and putting on pressure to your opponent. Now, of course, Vaporeon is probably going to be able to tank a hit before it goes down, but really, if you're putting your Vaporeon VMAX in harm's way that gives up 3 prizes, you really want to be getting in some damage and getting the most value out of your VMAX as possible. And I think that's where this first attack loses me. It's a lot more interesting than the second attack and has actually a lot of potential. But again, I'm just really turned off by the speed of it. The second attack, I think, does get a little bit more interesting for a few reasons. Getting a damage counter on your opponent's Pokemon really is not a big issue at all. We do have things like Galarian Zigzagoon still in the format with the Scoop Up Net engine, and the Rapid Strike Inteleon could be a good way at getting some chip damage in while giving you the excellent sort of Drizzile engine to get your deck ready and set up. Not only being a Rapid Strike Pokemon, but being a Rapid Strike Pokemon with water and its attack cost means we can also use Rapid Strike energy. That, in conjunction with the new Elemental Badge that's coming out in this same set, means that we can actually attack with Vaporeon VMAX in a single turn. All we have to do is throw down our tool card that reduces its attack cost by 1, and then throw down a Rapid Strike energy with it, and now we can actually get this up and running, do 200 damage, ideally, for a single attachment. And that's pretty good, I do have to say. And because you're playing things like Rapid Strike energy already, you could even start to play other things like Zeraora V, Rapid Strike Urshifu, Blaziken VMAX, etc. But I think the thing that's really going against Vaporeon in particular is its poor typing. Fire looks to be taking a pretty big hit in the rotation, of course losing Welder, which has been the backbone of so many decks, leaving only Victini VMAX to be the only potential threat looming in the new format. Because if we are going to play some combination of Pokemon VMAX that can use Rapid Strike energy, obviously Urshifu is going to be one of the big ones, but we also have Sylveon coming out in this set, which can hit a good bit of stuff for weakness. And Urshifu has already started to use other things like Galarian Moltres V to not only give it some energy acceleration, but also to sort of cover its weakness against certain decks in the format. I just don't really see where Vaporeon sort of fits into that mix. So I think Vaporeon is a card worth kind of keeping our eye on because interesting first attack, very energy efficient, solid second attack. There might even be a world where we use Vaporeon just as a method of accelerating like weird stage 2s into play to help lock our opponent at some point. I mean, who knows? I think this card is definitely cool. I just don't think the stage has been set for this card to really succeed compared to some of the other Rapid Strike VMAXs that we currently have and are getting in this same set. Up next, we have Suicune V. Suicune, of course, is going to be a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, lightning weakness, 2 retreat cost, and it has an ability. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active, you may draw a card, and its only attack for a Watercolorist is 20 plus 20 more for each bench Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's. So I'd say when I first looked at Suicune back in my first impressions video, when this card first was revealed, really not too excited about it, but actually as time has gone on, I've actually warmed up more and more to this card. Because for decks that are playing Melanie, I think Suicune actually does offer a decent 2-prize backup attacker for your sort of Ice Rider Calyrex decks. You can now integrate Suicune into your line of play that forces your opponent into an 8-prize game, where after they knock out your first Ice Rider Calyrex, you pivot into your Suicune, force them down to just 1 prize, and then pivot back into your VMAX to finish out the game. So I think even in that context, Suicune could very easily pop up as a potential 1, maybe 2 of. But also, we've seen Japan experiment with some pretty interesting stuff with this and the new Altaria that we're going to be getting in this same set. Altaria allows you to stack your deck with a supporter card that you want, and then using Suicune's ability, you can just draw into it. And who knows, that might be a style of deck that could prove to be pretty decent in the post-rotation format as well. Now, of course, the big downside to Suicune is that it has an attack your opponent can kind of just play around. You know, they don't have to bench excess Pokemon. If they see you're playing Suicune, especially if you have a very Suicune heavy deck, they can just choose to maybe bench 1, maybe 2 things and kind of call it a day and limit your damage output a good bit. But if we do quickly run through the math, if we are playing against a normal deck that is not Eternatus VMAX, and both players have full benches, we cap out at 220, which is actually a really solid number, because not only does that 2-shot any of the Pokemon VMAX out there, but also that allows us to basically 1-shot just about any 2-prize Pokemon that is in the format as well. And if you do want to go all in on Suicune, even though we are losing Mawile GX in the rotation, we still have Echoing Horn, so we can maybe force some Crobats onto our opponent's bench, and maybe even use Altaria to get a boss and draw into it and just immediately knock it out. That seems like kind of a cool line of play I definitely wouldn't mind doing. So that's it. I think I am a fan of Suicune. It's easy to power up, the ability is decent, and I think it serves a purpose both in terms of being a backup attacker in Ice Rider decks, but also I think has enough to kind of stand on its own legs and maybe be its own deck too. Next up, guys, we have Ludicolo. Ludicolo is going to be a stage 2 Pokemon, and it has an interesting ability here. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may use this ability. During this turn, the attacks of your basic Pokemon do 100 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon before applying weakness and resistance. So if you're playing something like a Ludicolo, now you can probably push your basic attackers all the way up to potentially 1-shot Pokemon VMAX, which is kind of enticing. And you do have to remember we have a Lombre still in the format with the top entry ability that will allow you to bench it whenever you draw into it for turn. So that could be a way to help expedite your Ludicolos if you want to. But as you guys can tell by my rating, I'm just not too sold on this. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a stage 2, guys. You're going to need at least like a 2-1-2 line, or like a 3-1-3 line, or like a 3-3-3 with Lombres or something like that. And that's a ton of deck space. I mean, granted, you are doing 100 more damage potentially, but I think if I'm going to play something like Ludicolo, I almost kind of would rather play Bayonet. And the reason I say that is Bayonet from Vivid Voltage fills a very similar role by helping your basics like Zacian, for example, more easily deal with Pokemon VMAX out there. So in the case of Ludicolo, you're doing 100 more damage to instantly take a knockout, but in the case of Bayonet, you get to de-evolve them. So of course you do have to wait a turn to de-evolve them after you've done your damage, and they do have to be on the bench. And you do get 1 less prize than if you just knocked out the VMAX right there. I almost feel like the extra deck space that Bayonet grants you is kind of worth going down that route instead. I think it's going to be easier to use Bayonet on the turns that you want to. We have the Scoop Up Net engine to more easily allow you to reuse the ability. Granted, you can do the same thing for Ludicolo, but if you're doing things like Rare Candies or Lombres, it's going to be a lot more difficult to chain this ability back to back. And just think, Bayonet is also a card that, while I think a little bit better than this, also is a card that doesn't see too much play. So I think that kind of just speaks to how good this new Ludicolo is going to be. This ability is actually pretty good, but the issue, of course, is that it is on a stage 2. So this one's going to be a pass for me, unfortunately. So next up we have another Rapid Strike card. This is going to be a new Milotic. Milotic is a stage 1 Pokemon, and its ability says prevent all effects done to you or your hand by supporter cards your opponent plays from their hand. And then it has just one sort of mediocre attack, flip 2 coins, 70 for each heads. But of course, guys, you can tell this ability is really why we are ever going to discuss this card. And this basically says, hey, if your opponent plays Marnie, they can kick rocks. Like, it's not going to do anything to your hand. So that's kind of nice. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I can't count how many games I've played where I'm like, okay, sick, we've got a good hand. Next turn's going to be great. We're going to boss. We might even have game. Then your opponent just Marnies you into 4 completely dead cards, and you just get swept. I know it's happened to me. I know it's happened to you guys. Being able to prevent that is actually kind of enticing, I do have to say. But I will say that I'm not sold on Milotic as a general sort of tech card against things like Marnie. Because if you're playing Milotic, you're at the very least dedicating 2 spots in your deck to countering Marnie. And I think most of the time you can just use those spots that you would be dedicating for Milotic, just put them into being other supporter cards or cards like Crobat as an example to make your deck more consistent. Now, the reason I'm not completely downvoting this card, however, is there are certain attackers out there from time to time that specifically don't want their hand touched. On screen, you can see a couple of the ones that immediately came to mind for me. We have Togekiss VMAX, Greedent, and the new Smeargle that we're going to be talking about later in the set review. But there's even other stuff like, of course, Shadow Rider Calyrex that is always looking to sort of expand its hand size and grow it larger. I know there's like an Indeedee card in the format that does more damage times the amount of cards in your hand. So I think if Milotic ever does see play, it'll be for these types of decks where if they get Marnied, it crushes their whole strategy. So in that case, Milotic might be worth the space. Otherwise, just save the deck space, guys. Play other consistency boosting cards to help draw out of those awful Marnies that you get hit with. Next up, we have the second Water Eeveelution VMAX that we're going to be talking about. And of course, that is going to be Glaceon VMAX here. And Glaceon V actually does have 2 pretty solid attacks. Of course, the first one, Ice Ascension, is going to be the main one people are going to be looking at because you can just immediately evolve into a Glaceon VMAX. So if you're going second, you can slap down a Water Energy and start walling your opponent ASAP. And then its attack, honestly, I don't think should be overlooked too much either. For Watercolorist Colorist is 120 and you discard a Stadium. The Stadium discard sometimes could wind up being impactful with Path to the Peak being a card that's in the format right now, which definitely could be an annoyance for your VMAX's ability. So it's not the best attack by any means, but it at least has synergy with the VMAX that we are attempting to play. Now, Glaceon VMAX, like I said, does have a strong ability here. It's basically just a Zamazenta V, but slightly more limited. So, of course, you prevent all damage done by your opponent's Pokemon VMAX, but this does exclude opposing Glaceon VMAX. So at least this way mirror matches don't get super degenerate, I suppose. So yeah, Crystal Veil is a very solid ability, especially now that we are losing tag teams. I think VMAXs are easily going to be the most widely played type of card in the format. Then Glaceon also has an attack, which is decent as well. For water, 2 colorist is 150, and then does 30 to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So kind of like Inteleon VMAX's attack, a little bit weaker, which is kind of fair since you have a really solid ability, but we do still have things like Telescopic Sight to augment our damage a little bit, and the 30 and 150 actually does kind of stack nicely, just because if you do 30 to a Crobat, you can eventually boss it up and finish it off at some point. So the math still kind of works out for you a little bit. Glaceon VMAX also does share the same exclusive badge tool card that the Leafeon does, meaning we can use the same one on Glaceon to eliminate its weakness, which is actually a good weakness to eliminate, and also give it free retreat. So I definitely do think there are some really good qualities about this evolution line here, but Path to the Peak is everywhere right now, and not having Chaotic Swell in the format now does make this ability a little bit hard to stick around. We're still going to see plenty of people playing things like Cincino and Inteleon in conjunction with Path to the Peak, since we're really not losing any of those core engines in the rotation. And that might be an issue for Glaceon. We of course also do still have Zamazenta V in the format as well, which is a basic Pokemon and can probably accelerate energy to itself a little bit easier with Metal Saucer too. Of course, the advantage to Glaceon, however, is you are a VMAX, so you can take a hit. Zamazenta is going to be definitely a little bit more fragile and susceptible to those Path to the Peaks. So as you guys can tell, I actually do like Glaceon. I think there is a lot to enjoy here. It works with Melanie, has a great exclusive tool card for itself, walls against a ton of stuff in the format. But its damage output, a little bit mediocre. It's very, very susceptible to Path to the Peak, which I definitely do not expect to see go away anytime soon, especially now that Swell is going to be rotating. So it's definitely a card to keep an eye on, but not one I can personally commit to saying is good just yet. So next up, we're going to take a look at a pretty interesting wishy-washy that we have here. It's a puny little 30 HP basic. It's a Rapid Strike card that largely is irrelevant for this discussion. Has this ability: if this Pokemon has at least 3 water energy attached to it, this Pokemon gets 150 HP. And its only attack for 2 colorist is 30 plus 30 more for each basic energy attached to this Pokemon. So okay, you guys can see how this deck could be built. You just dump a ton of energy on Wishy-Washy with Frostmoth, turn this thing into a 180 HP one prize Pokemon with, in theory, an unlimited damage cap. Doesn't sound too bad, especially since we do have like some other ways that sort of compounding this strategy. We have Cape of Toughness as well. So between Cape and this ability, we can give our Wishy-Washy 230 HP, which is insane for just a one prize card like this. And then there's a ton of ways to chain energies every turn as well. We have energy retrieval, training court, even EXP share if you want to go that route as well. So while yes, it's possible to one-shot anything with Wishy-Washy, you really need an unreasonable amount of energy if you want to try to knock out any VMAXs. I think most of the time you just have to concede that you're going to go for 2 shots with this card. And if you do want to ensure 2 shots with your Wishy-Washies, you're going to need 5 energy on a Wishy-Washy every time you want to attack. And even though Wishy-Washy can increase its HP a lot between Cape and this ability, I actually don't think it's going to put it out of one-shot range against a lot of stuff in the format, which means every turn you're going to be forced to find a new Wishy-Washy and 5 energy to accelerate with Frostmoth as well. It'd maybe be different if this was a card kind of like Lapras VMAX that has a similar strategy, but Lapras can take a hit and give you the extra turn you need to start setting up your next attacker in advance. Wishy-Washy doesn't really afford you that luxury, unfortunately. And I think the other issue I have with this card is really just opposing Rapid Strike cards. Unfortunately, Evolving Skies is not delivering us some sort of bench sniping protection like I was really hoping it would. So now cards like Rapid Strike Urshifu can wreak havoc on your board. You know, let's say you do go against Urshifu and they go first. What do? You have to set up essentially 3 Snoms in case they snipe your Snoms. So even though we are losing ADP, it's just a really bad time for decks like this. Even the base form Shadow Rider Calyrex V can kind of wreak havoc on your Wishy-Washies if you have not yet gotten set up. So yeah, guys, I am going to pass on Wishy-Washy for the moment. I actually do like this card, and had Mew been in the format, I would actually probably give this card a different rating, but because we have like virtually no bench protection in the format right now, and the amount of energy that you need every single turn with these Wishy-Washies, I think I am going to pass. I think it's going to be maybe a little too hard to chain these throughout the course of a game. And for the final water Pokemon we're going to look at today, it's going to be Arctovish V. This is a card we actually kind of expected to get already, but it was withheld from our Chilling Rain set. But here it is. So it's a basic Pokemon, 220 HP, 2 different attacks. The first one for a water and 2 colorist is 80. And if the defending Pokemon is a Pokemon V or GX, it can't attack during your opponent's next turn. And its other attack for 2 water, 2 colorist is 220. And this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So I think at a glance, this first attack actually seems kind of cool. It's like, well, most of the format's Pokemon V. So if they can't attack, what's the issue with that? Well, the issue, of course, is that most decks, and I don't expect this to change after rotation either, are going to be playing very heavy switching counts. Because if you use this attack and then your opponent just switches and comes back to the active or attacks with something different or evolves into a VMAX, well, guess what? This whole effect has been reset and now they can attack into your Arctovish. I think really for this card to have had any chance, the wording of this attack would have needed to slightly have been changed. Instead of placing the effect on your opponent, this really needed to put the effect on yourself. So instead of preventing your opponent from attacking, it needs to prevent damage to itself from those Pokemon, if that makes sense. And its second attack isn't really much better to fall back on, as it's just a worse version of Brave Blade. Costs more energy, requires at least a stage 1 to get set up, doesn't have an amazing ability like Intrepid Sword. So even though it does have Frostmoth, even though it does have Cape of Toughness to make this thing tankier, I think this, like many basic Pokemon V we look at, is just kind of a worse version of Zacian V. Alrighty guys, so next up we're going to be taking a look at a brand new Raichu card that's going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, 130 HP, 2 retreat cost, and fighting weakness. And it has 2 different attacks here. The first one for a lightning energy. It does 50 to each Pokemon V and Pokemon GX in play, both yours and your opponent's. And its other attack for 2 lightning and a colorist is 180, and you discard all energy cards from this Pokemon. So the second attack, yes, we can power this up with the new Flaffy that we're going to be talking about, but really I think the main focus of this card should probably be its first attack. You know, a 50 spread on its own isn't too impactful, but luckily I think a deck like this actually has a lot of tools at its disposal to compound that damage output. Of course, the big one's going to be Telescopic Sight, since that will increase its damage by 30. So doing an 80 spread to each of your opponent's Pokemon V, that's suddenly a little bit better. And being a single prize Pokemon means that you're probably going to be able to get off around 5 of these attacks per game. And that's actually more than enough damage you need to knock out your opponent's Pokemon VMAX. And that's not factoring other things like Galarian Zigzagoons, or maybe some cards like Spike Myth or Old Cemetery to double down on your damage counter placing abilities. I think an attack like this pre-rotation would have been no good whatsoever, primarily because of ADP not giving decks like this enough turns to even have a shot at winning. But without ADP in the format, and without Mew in the new format, Raichu actually has a lot fewer barriers to potentially prevent it from being successful. Now, that being said, you guys can tell by my rating, I do definitely have some reservations about this card. The first one of which, of course, is that this attack only applies to multi-prize Pokemon. So if you do go against something like a Mad Party deck or a Decidueye deck, you really are not going to have too many great answers unless you are playing some other sort of backup attacker or a Flaffy line to be able to use Thunderbolt at some point. But really, I think the big gatekeeper now in the format for cards like this are going to be Rapid Strike Urshifu, actually. Because even though Raichu likes the fact that Mew is not in format, this is the type of deck that actually does get punished by opposing sniping decks like Rapid Strike Urshifu. You know, with Gmax Rapid Flow, it's not difficult for them to knock out multiple Raichus at a time, leaving you without an attacker. And much like how ADP is, Rapid Strike Urshifu can cheat extra prizes per turn with its sniping attack, which might put Raichu on too fast of a clock to actually close out games against it. But overall, a part of me still really likes this Raichu card. You know, it's a stage 1 that attacks for a single energy, so it's really easy to stream these throughout the course of a game. It's a lightning type, which means it can abuse speed lightning energy as its attachment of choice to help make the deck more consistent. On top of that, there's lots of ways at doubling down on our spread strategy. Being a single energy attacker also opens up Raichu to maybe using Aurora energy and some other attackers to maybe cover some of its weaknesses a little bit better. We'll have to see. But I do think there is some potential to this card. And if it can figure out how to survive in the same format as Rapid Strike Urshifu, I think Raichu might potentially have a shot at some point. Next up, we have Jolteon VMAX, another Gen 1 lightning spread attacker here. And before we talk about the VMAX, I do briefly want to point out that Jolteon V has an okay first attack for a colorless energy. It does 20 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Doesn't seem like anything special, but it does actually have synergy with the VMAX's attack. But of course, the VMAX is going to be the more exciting card here. It is a 300 HP Pokemon weak to fighting. More on that later. That is definitely, I think, a concern for me. And it does have free retreat, which is something I really do like. But its attack here for a lightning and colorless is 100, and this also does 100 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon that has any damage counters on it. Okay, so even though this isn't the heaviest hitting attack in the world, especially compared to other VMAXs that attack for 2 energy, I think this is a very efficient sniping attack. You know, in the case of the Raichu that we just looked at, you don't always even want to do spread to everything. Sometimes you just want to spread to just a couple of Pokemon, because that might be how you're mapping out your prizes to win the game in your mind. So I really don't mind the fact this is only hitting 100 on 2 different Pokemon. But again, harkening back to our discussion about Raichu, we have a lot of ways at actually compounding that sort of strategy. The big one is going to be Telescopic Sight to do more bench damage. And I think the damage from Telescopic Sight actually does line up pretty well for Jolteon. So think of something like a Zacian V, just as an easy example, 220 HP total. So we do 100 to it, and then on the following turn, if we can get that Zacian onto the bench, we can do 130 with a Telescopic Sight, finishing it off. So I think the math actually does work out pretty well. And again, that applies even more to Pokemon VMAX. The Telescopic Sight does change the 4-shot to a 3-shot, which is really important. Now, of course, the big issue with this attack is that you have to have damage preemptively on a Pokemon that you want to target. So you might have to run something like Galarian Zigzagoons, Inteleon, maybe Flapple, or potentially even other stuff like Old Cemetery or Spikement as well. But I think that's a pretty easy requirement to sort of overcome with this attack. If we actually want to get this up and running a little bit quicker, all of the Gen 1 Eeveelutions are actually getting their own tool card, which will reduce their attack cost by a colorless energy. So if you want to run that, you can actually get this attack off for a single lightning energy, which could be a speed lightning if you want to speed up your deck. No pun intended, of course. So yeah, I think Jolteon's actually a pretty efficient attacker, very easy to get up and going. But as you guys can tell by my rating, I am a little bit worried about this card, mainly because of its fighting weakness, to be honest. If this card even had just like 310 HP, I would be maybe leaning a little bit more towards saying this card is good. But because a Gale Thrust with no damage modifiers can knock out Jolteon, I'm a little bit worried about this card's place in the metagame. Again, I'm kind of working under the assumption that Rapid Strike Urshifu is still going to be a very solid attacker in the upcoming format. And as long as that kind of holds to be true, Jolteon is going to have some issues that it might have to overcome. Now, one of the positive parts about this card is that it has a colorless energy in its attack cost, and we have a tool that reduces its attack cost, which might open you up to playing other sorts of energies, maybe like Aurora Energy, to maybe play some sort of other attackers that can cover your weakness a little bit better. Or hopefully the post-rotation metagame will be pretty diverse and allow you to just take the L to Rapid Strike Urshifu while simultaneously doing well against other decks. That would also be nice. Again, a lot of this is kind of speculation on my part of how the post-rotation format's going to look once the dust settles. So it is kind of hard for me to predict where Jolteon's going to land, but I do like this card. As you guys can tell, I think there is a lot to be excited about. And it's definitely my favorite out of the Gen 1 Eeveelution VMAXs that we are looking at today. Alright guys, next up we have Flaaffy, debatably one of the best Pokemon that we're getting in this set. Flaaffy is basically an identical reprint other than in name to the Electric all the way back from Nibble Victories. Has the Dynamotor ability, you may attach a lightning energy from discard to one of your bench Pokemon, and it has a pretty mediocre attack, Electric Ball for 2 lightning and a colorless for a flat 50 damage. So yeah, let's get this straight. We're never attacking with Flaaffy. We're probably never running an Ampharos in our deck unless we need maybe like a one of as a Decidueye counter. Flaaffy is definitely the star of the show out of this evolution line. And obviously the big card people are thinking about in this set with Flaaffy is going to be Rayquaza VMAX. And this whole archetype they're pushing is almost identical to an old Electric deck with a Rayquaza EX that functioned almost the same as this new VMAX. So if you were a fan of the old Ray Eels deck from the 2012 era, you're going to feel right at home with these new cards coming out in Evolving Skies. But yeah, this ability is fantastic, guys. We've seen this over the years, not only on Electric, but we've seen it on other things like Bronzong for Metal Pokemon, Malamar for Psychic Pokemon, even going back way further to Blaziken from Ruby and Sapphire for Fire Pokemon. These abilities have always been fantastic, and now we're basically going to have to take a hard look at any Lightning Pokemon that gets reprinted because now it has a way at accelerating energy to it. So cards like Bolton V, Toxtricity VMAX, Pikachu VMAX, etc. These are cards we might need to knock the dust off and test them out in this new format to see if they have any potential now that Flaaffy is in the mix. Another thing I really do like about Flaaffy is that this might even be our way at cheating extra energies into play for single prize decks that were previously reliant on a combination of twin and triple acceleration energy. So think of a deck like Mad Party as an easy example. A deck like that really kind of falls apart a little bit after rotation with the lack of triple acceleration energy. But now that we have Flaaffy, we actually might have a way at setting up a Mad Party attack in a single turn if we don't have access to twin energy. So Flaaffy is all around kind of, I think, a slam dunk card. It's a level ball searchable. Air Balloon works on it. Nothing but positive things to say about this. The only downside is that a card like this is going to be susceptible to Rapid Strike Urshifu and other sniping cards since we don't have any good bench protection in the new format. But that being said, guys, Flappy is absolutely fantastic. Definitely going to be an evolution line that does see play. Next up, we finally have Rayquaza VMAX. This was a card that we were supposed to get a while back, but it was withheld. But it's finally being released here in Evolving Skies. And if we briefly take a look at the Rayquaza V, I think it does have an okay first attack. Does 30, and your opponent can't attach energy from their hand to the defending Pokemon. Nothing groundbreaking, but it might potentially buy you a turn. But Rayquaza VMAX, of course, is going to be the more exciting of the two. Its first attack for a lightning energy to 60, and during your opponent's next turn, if this Pokemon is damaged by an attack, even if it's knocked out, put 12 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. And its other attack for a lightning and 3 colorless just does a flat 200. So I think this card, if it had a shot at seeing play, I think it would have been more likely to back in the pre-rotation format, since it actually did lose a few cards that I think pair really well with it. I think one of the big ones is going to be Giant Bomb. You could potentially play Giant Bomb and just go all in on this first attack here with Cheryl's and stuff like that to tank a bunch of damage and do a ton of damage to your opponent every time they attack into you. And then also we are losing triple acceleration energy, which could power up your second attack to give you a quick 200 damage in a pinch if you do need it. So losing those cards, I think, are a little bit big for Rayquaza in the post-rotation format. And even in pre-rotation, I'm not even convinced that would have been enough to make this card see play. 200 damage for 4 is doable thanks to something like Flappy, but that's just a really bad damage to energy ratio. In this first attack, while kind of good in a vacuum, forcing your opponent to take 12 damage counters every time they attack you is something that's nice. It is something that can also be played around with things like Boss's Orders, with cards like Escape Rope. And even if your opponent takes 12 damage counters, because your second attack takes so much energy to get powered up, more than likely you're just going to do another 60 on your next turn and probably not even finish off your opponent's Pokemon. And again, that's where something like a Giant Bomb would have kind of come in handy a little bit more. Like, we have Rocky Helmet, but I don't think that's enough to really double down on this strategy. And even though we have some decent lightning support with things like Speed Lightning Energy and the new Stadium card to help get our basic Pokemon to play a little bit quicker, I don't think that's going to be enough to save Rayquaza, so I'm going to pass on this guy. Next up, we have another spreading lightning Pokemon. That definitely seems to be a theme in this set, but this is going to be Regieleki. So it's a basic Pokemon, 120 HP, fighting weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. Its first attack, just a flat 20 for 1, but its second attack, a little bit more interesting, 2 lightning, and a colorless is 120. You discard all lightning energy attached to this Pokemon, and it does 40 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So even though I am kind of beating a dead horse at this point, we do have Telescopic Sight to help these lightning spread Pokemon. And with Mew not in the format anymore, rarely ever is there going to be something that can stop this bench damage from this attack. However, I do think Regieleki actually might be a little bit clunkier to use than some of the other spreaders that we looked at already, like Jolteon and Raichu. Regieleki kind of requires Flappy to get up and running, which is doable. You really only need 2 Flappy in play at any given point to be able to chain these Regielekis. And the fact that you have to discard all of your energy every time you use this attack does make you extra vulnerable to cards that can snipe your bench or boss up your Flappies. Whereas something like Jolteon VMAX we looked at is already a little bit sturdier and has much more constant damage, and Raichu only attacks for a single energy, not necessarily needing to play an additional stage 1 line. So I'm probably actually not sold that we're building around Regieleki itself. I could debatably see this as more of like a one-of potentially in Rayquaza decks to maybe finish off Pokemon, or to maybe give yourself a heavier hitting answer to something like Decidueye instead of having to attack with your Flappies. So I think when it comes to a rating for this card, this was a little bit tricky for me to land on a rating for. I definitely see practical application for a card like this. It has a ton of support to get up and running, but I think I am going to be a little bit closer to the negative side on this for the moment. I think there's a lot of competing lightning Pokemon to spread with, as you've seen in this set review. I think this guy in particular is just super susceptible to boss and sniping plays. And I'm not even convinced that as a one-up in some of these other Flappy decks, that Regieleki would be the best choice either. So for the moment, I'm gonna pass, but this is a card I still probably will have on hand just in case the time is right for it. But for the moment, my outlook is a little bit grim on it. So next up, we have the first of the single prize Galarian bird trio. This is going to be Articuno that we're going to be checking out first. It has this ability: when you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may attach 2 Psychic Energy cards from your hand to it. Then it has an attack for a Psychic and 2 Colorist. You discard all Psychic energy from this Pokemon. Then it does 120 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So the attack here that we have is, okay, you can basically throw this guy down, attach one more energy from hand, and be able to hit for 120 somewhere. Not awful, but really this ability is really why this card might see any play at all. And you guys can probably already think about how this might be used, and that's going to be in the context of Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX and or Alchemy VMAX. Because of course, with Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX, its attack does more damage for every psychic energy you have on your field, and kind of in the same way, Alchemy VMAX does more damage for every psychic energy you discard. So in both cases, Galarian Articuno is actually going to give your deck a damage buff, which is really nice. Now, even though I think just at a quick glance, this seems like a slam dunk of a card, it's also kind of awkward, especially in the context of Shadow Rider Calyrex, because if you're using this ability, that means you're not accelerating energy with your ability and drawing cards that way. Because most of the time, if you have psychic energy that you want to attach to a Pokemon, you'd rather do it with your Calyrex and draw cards in the process, instead of just throwing down this Articuno on your bench that is going to be largely irrelevant most of the time. But I also definitely could see turns where you've already used your abilities with Calyrex, and then you still have access to maybe some more energy, maybe thanks to something like a training court or an energy retrieval. Well, at that point, then Articuno definitely gives you a lot of value and doesn't step on the toes of your Shadow Riders. So I definitely don't think Articuno will see play in these sorts of decks as like a 3 or 4 of or anything. I think more than likely Articuno will probably be like a 1 of, maybe a 2 of, or if maybe these decks find room for like a scoop up net engine, I could definitely see Articuno being like a 1 of with scoop up nets to be able to reuse this every turn. And actually, because of Articuno, I think this actually might even open up the door for a designated Alchemy VMAX deck without Shadow Rider. Because with cards like Rose, Articuno, Scoop Up Nets, etc., you might even just be able to build your own Alchemy VMAX deck, which might bring a little bit of diversity to our viable Psychic decks in the format. Now, you guys can probably tell I am a little bit conflicted by where I want to land on this card. I do think this ability definitely has application, but the cards that you want to pair it with kind of pull in the other direction at the same time. But even with that, if you even can play like 1 Articuno per game and get 1 use out of this, I think that's going to be enough to potentially justify this card's spot in your Shadow Rider or Alchemy VMAX deck. So I am going to land on a positive rating for this card, but I do still have a little bit of concern. I would caution people, I don't think this card is quite as good as some in the community are making it out to be. But even with that said, I still think the card is good enough to see mild play at the very least. For our next Eeveelution VMAX, we're going to check out, it's going to be Espeon VMAX. Espeon is going to be a Psychic type Pokemon with 310 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. Its ability says, prevent all effects of your opponent's attacks except damage done to each of your Pokemon that has any energy attached to it. And it has an attack of its own as well for a Psychic and 2 Colorist to 60 for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon in play. So just really quick, I actually don't think this attack is that great just in general. I really don't think we have too many decks that are going to be based around keeping energy in play. I know that does seem weird since we have Shadow Rider in the format, but I think post-rotation, some of those decks might be focused a little bit more on Alchemy VMAX. And if you look at the rest of the popular decks, whether it's Ice Rider Calyrex, Rayquaza VMAX, Rapid Strike Urshifu, a lot of the major decks in the format are going to be based around discarding their energy. And otherwise, you need 6 energy in play for this to be able to one-shot a VMAX. So it's not a bad attack. It just doesn't really capitalize on any particularly strong cards that exist right now in the game. So the ability is definitely, I think, more of where Espeon could maybe see play. And this ability is actually a reprint of an ability that we had on an old Espeon all the way back from Dark Explorers. Almost identical, preventive effects of attacks in the same way here. But much like in the case of this attack, I think this ability is printed on a Pokemon that exists in the wrong time during the game. Right now, effects of attacks really aren't too prevalent. Most of the big heavy-hitting Pokemon are focused on just normal damage. There's not really any attacks focused on status conditions, and this doesn't even really help very much against decks like Dragapult that spread damage counters because you do have to have energy attached to the Pokemon you want to protect with this ability. So I just think this ability is kind of limited, and there really just aren't great attacks that you want to prevent right now in the game. So of course that's highly subject to change. This could completely turn around even within the course of one set. So Espeon VMAX might be worth having on hand in case that time comes, but right now I just don't see a good practical application for this card, so I'm going to pass on this one. Alrighty guys, next up we have a new Wobbuffet, and this is going to be a single strike card, and we're really going to hone in on this first attack for this conversation. For 2 colorless energy, you choose one of your bench Pokemon, count the number of damage counters on that Pokemon, and put the same number of damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think just in general, this is kind of a weird card for the single strike toolbox. Single strike cards are normally all about doing crazy amounts of damage, and single strike energy actually doesn't even affect this card's damage output, which is kind of wild to think about, at least not with this particular attack. But believe it or not, I think there is like a world where this attack can be half decent. Let's say, for example, you're playing single strike Urshifu VMAX. You attack your opponent, they attack back into you. Then from there, you pivot into your Wobbuffet, put your Urshifu on the bench, and then do a ton of damage back to your opponent with a single prize Pokemon instead of having to attack again with your 3-prizer and force your opponent to have something like a boss's orders. But of course, as I just mentioned, your opponent can boss around Wobbuffet, they can snipe around it. And if they knock out the Pokemon that you have in play with damage counter, suddenly this card gets substantially worse. So I think a lot of the more viable single strike Pokemon already don't have a whole lot of flexible deck space. And I'm just really not convinced that if they're going to find a space for one more card in their list, it's going to be Wobbuffet. So yeah, there is some practical application for this, but I think most time it's going to be a little bit too situational to be a reliable tech card. Next up, guys, we have Golurk V. Golurk is going to be a basic Pokemon V with 220 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 3 retreat cost. And this is going to be a single strike card, which is very important to point out. But it has 2 different attacks. The first one is going to be kind of forgettable, Psychic 2 colors for 80. But the second attack, much more interesting, 2 Psychic 2 colors for 180. And if your opponent's active is an evolved Pokemon, remove the highest stage evolution card to de-evolve it and return that card to your opponent's hand. So in a way, this attack might seem like kind of lame. You're doing 4 for 180, but really I think how you should be interpreting this attack is take a one-hit KO on Pokemon VMAX, but you get 1 fewer prize card. And that's really how you would be attempting to play this to begin with. Because if you have 2 single strike energies on Golurk, you're hitting for 220, and then the de-evolution from this attack is usually going to make it to where your opponent is one-shotted by this attack. So even though you are giving their evolution back into their hand, being able to wipe their VMAX off the board, getting rid of all of their energy, and just drawing 1 fewer prize card isn't, I think, a big downside. You know, I'm actually kind of willing to trade that extra prize card if it means being able to more quickly disrupt our opponent's board position. Now, the big issue, unfortunately, with Golurk is that its attack cost is kind of awkward. You know, had this been 1 Psychic and 2 Colorless, this actually would have been an amazing attack. I actually would be really excited about this, because then all you would have to do is accelerate 2 energy with Houndoom, and attach a Psychic Energy for turn and call it a day. But because it's 2 Psychic Energy, that means you are going to have to run some sort of additional acceleration if you want a way at setting up a Golurk in a single turn. So now if you want to set this guy up, you're going to have to run maybe something like a Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX in addition to Houndoom, or take your chance with something maybe like Turbo Patch. So because of all this, Golurk goes from being a really great card to being one that has kind of a questionable future. So had this attack cost just been literally 1 Psychic Energy less, we'd actually be looking at a great card in this set. Because of that 1 extra Psychic Energy, I think that is going to be a little bit too much to ask of Golurk every single time that you want to attack. Alrighty guys, next up we have a new Florges. This is going to be a Psychic Pokemon, 130 HP with Metal Weakness and a 2 retreat cost. But it does have a pretty interesting ability. It says, as many times as you like during your turn, you may move an energy from one of your Pokemon to another of your Rapid Strike Pokemon. So this is actually a type of card we've seen time and time again throughout the course of the Pokemon TCG. If we look back in the history of the game, some of the most dominant decks have employed a strategy kind of like this. You know, one of the big ones that comes to mind for me is the old Darkrai Hydreigon deck and the Klinklang deck that abuse things like Max Potion with a very similar style of ability. And right now in the format, we do have kind of a similar engine. Since we do have Cheryl in the format, we can move all of our energy off of our Rapid Strike Pokemon, heal all of that damage off, then move the energy back and keep on attacking. Now on paper, this doesn't seem too bad, but if we look at some of the more prominent Rapid Strike attackers, the two big ones that come to mind for me are going to be Rapid Strike Urshifu and Rayquaza VMAX. And is there anything you guys notice about both of their attacks? They're based around discarding energy. So in the case of some of these Rapid Strike Pokemon, I actually don't even think that you're going to be able to pull off this whole combo because there's not going to be energy for you to actually move around. You would probably just forgo playing Florges and just use Cheryl instead. You know, there is a new Vaporeon VMAX coming out in this same set, which does have some degree of potential and it doesn't discard its own energy. So you could maybe play it with something like that, but I mean, we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel over here. I don't think Vaporeon is near the top of the list when it comes to promising VMAXs that's coming out of Evolving Skies. And all this kind of just leaves Florges really without a home, I think. And me personally, I think even if there was a better Rapid Strike attacker that might be able to abuse the whole Cheryl combo, I don't think I'm playing a stage 2, to be honest, to do this. It's just going to be a lot of deck space for a card that's going to get you very little value most of the time. So who knows, maybe down the road there will be some Rapid Strike Pokemon that synergize better, but for the moment it's going to be a hard pass for me, even though this ability historically has been pretty good in the past. Next up, guys, we have another Eeveelution VMAX. This is going to be Sylveon VMAX. And before we get to the VMAX, I actually do think Sylveon V itself is a pretty good card. Mainly just for its ability. Once during your turn, you may search your deck for one item card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. But if you use this ability, your turn ends. So kind of in the same vein as something like Intrepid Sword, and a lot of times this can set you up for your next turn. Maybe you can grab an Evolution Incense to search out your Sylveon VMAX. You can grab a Pokegear to search for a supporter, whatever it might be that you might be needing. So really big fan of this ability here. So Sylveon VMAX, 310 HP, weakness to metal, and a 2 retreat cost. Its first attack, you attach an energy from your hand to one of your bench Pokemon, then heal 120 from that Pokemon. And then its other attack for 3 colorless energy to 70 plus 30 more for each type of Pokemon on your bench. This attack in particular is actually very similar to the old Rainbow Force attack on Xerneas. If you guys didn't play back during the XY era of the game, there was a Xerneas deck that people called Rainbow Road. It was built around just playing a bunch of different types, hitting for big damage. But I really think that's where the parallels between that card and this one are going to end. You know, back then there were dual type Pokemon that could help you do more damage, and we also had Skyfield to be able to put more different types of Pokemon on the bench that way. But unfortunately, we don't have anything quite that efficient to really, I think, go all in on this style of deck. The only thing I can really think of is the Kecleon that we got back in Chilling Reign. It's kind of cool. It has an ability that it changes its type to whatever basic energy is attached to it. So in theory, at least, I don't think in practice this is going to work, but in theory, you can have a Kecleon or a few Kecleon in play that have a bunch of different types of basic energy that could allow your Sylveon to have like a huge damage cap, but that requires so much energy both on your bench and on your Sylveon. I don't think that strategy is really going to work. I think Sylveon, if this card does see play, is going to be more as a backup attacker in Rapid Strike Urshifu decks. And the reason I say that is right now there is definitely sort of a rock, paper, scissors element to the game right now where Rapid Strike Urshifu is fighting. That beats your dark decks like Eternatus. The dark decks can beat the psychic decks, and then the psychic decks can beat Rapid Strike Urshifu. But with Sylveon VMAX, you actually now can cover all of those different types and kind of be a Rapid Strike toolbox that can power itself up thanks to Moltres and energy switches. And in that regard, I really don't think that's out of the realm of possibility to be a solid Urshifu variant. You don't have to play a thick line of Sylveon. You just need probably a 2-2 line. But between all of these different Pokemon I just outlined and other things like maybe Octillery or Kricketune V to help provide additional types, I don't think it's going to be that hard for you to creep your damage up high enough to be able to one-shot Psychic weak Pokemon. But as you guys can tell by my rating, I still have a little bit of reservation about even that being the most optimal way to play Urshifu, because I think the theory would be that Sylveon helps you in the mirror matches, but well, you could just cut the Sylveon line altogether and just play a more consistent Urshifu and Moltres deck to help beat the mirror that way as well, by just having a deck that functions more reliably than theirs. Now, I think this is going to be something that just genuinely requires a little bit of testing to see which might be a little bit better. But right now, I'm kind of leaning more in the direction of just playing a more consistent Urshifu list and foregoing the Sylveon altogether. But that being said, there is definitely still potential here in this Sylveon. I'm going to remain neutral on it. But right now, I think it's basically just going to be a potential backup attacker for Rapid Strike Urshifu, if at all. Next up, we're actually going to be talking about Pumpkaboo, not Gourgeist, though we are going to discuss that in just a minute as well. But Pumpkaboo, I think, is actually a really cool card that stands on its own in this evolution line. And we're really just looking at, for this ability, whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may use this ability, discard any stadium in play. So this card's coming out at just the right time since we are losing the Reset Whole Marshadow back from Unbroken Bonds, which had a very similar ability. I definitely think there are some pros and cons for Pumpkaboo compared to Marshadow. I think both the pro and the con to this card is the fact that it stays in play whenever you use this. So what I mean by that is because it just stays on your bench, you can actually reuse this if you are playing a scoop up net engine in your deck. But likewise, on the other hand, one of the nice things about Marshadow was the fact you could basically discard it from your field and open up a bench spot yet again. So essentially, you're just trading a slot on your bench to get rid of Path to the Peak. Most of the time, I think that's going to be the dynamic that's working here. This definitely could pop up in your Shadow Rider Calyrex decks and other decks that are very susceptible to Path to the Peak, as an example. And also in the context of Shadow Rider Calyrex, I think maybe even between this and Articuno coming out in the same set, maybe there's a world where Shadow Rider starts to integrate a scoop up net engine into the deck. I think that is something that might be worth experimenting with here. But I would still expect Pumpkaboo to see play even outside of Shadow Rider decks. Marshadow has seen play in a ton of different decks over its lifespan. Like, yeah, we have certain cards that can search out stadiums when we need them, but most of the time it's a lot easier to search your deck for a specific Pokemon than is a specific trainer card. So with Pumpkaboo being searchable by things like Quick Ball, Level Ball, and Fog Crystal, I think this is definitely a card that is positioned to see some play. Now getting on to Gourgeist, I think this card is a lot less interesting than its pre-evolution. Actually, I probably take that back. It's actually an interesting card, but it's definitely not a good one. So this thing has just one attack here. It says reveal the top 6 cards of your deck. This attack does 60 damage times the amount of Psychic Pokemon you find there. Then shuffle those Psychic Pokemon back into your deck and discard the other cards. So if you guys saw the Flareon VMAX portion of the set review, you can basically just kind of copy and paste my same criticisms of that card on the Gourgeist as well. It has the same issues where, yeah, in theory, your damage cap is actually pretty high. You can theoretically hit for 360, which is a great number, honestly. That's going to knock out basically any VMAX in the format. But in order to actually be able to do that, you have to play an absurd amount of Pokemon in your deck. Realistically, you're going to need to be playing like 30 plus Pokemon, but this attack is just so inconsistent, guys. You're not going to hit the damage that you want a lot of the time. And then having to discard the non-Pokemon you find there is just super harsh as well. You might have to sometimes discard twin energies or supporters that you would otherwise want to hang on to. So I can't say I'm a big fan of this card at all. Even if we still had triple acceleration energy in the format, I still would be pretty highly skeptical of this Gourgeist that we have. So I think I'm going to pass on this one, guys. Pumpkaboo is great. Pick yourself up a couple Pumpkaboo, but I think it's pretty safe to say its evolution might not see as much play. So next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Galarian Zapdos, which at a glance actually doesn't look too dissimilar from the Articuno that we just took a look at not long ago. But much like that one, has an ability that whenever you bench it from hand, you get to attach 2 energy. And of course, with Galarian Zapdos being fighting type, it is going to be fighting energy instead of psychic. And then its attack here for 2 fighting and a colorless does 70, and you may discard all energy from this Pokemon. If you do, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So much like in the case of Articuno, I think this attack is largely irrelevant. I don't think you would ever want to use this, especially since we're in a format where most decks are playing around 4 copies of Switch. This paralysis is rarely, if ever, going to actually stick. So if we're thinking about Zapdos, it has to be squarely in the context of using this ability. Now, unlike Articuno, I don't see many potentially good applications for fighting energy here. Now, of course, we do have stuff like Rapid Strike Urshifu that you could energy switch to, but I mean, Urshifu has already sort of found success with Moltres, and Moltres actually can cover your weakness as a backup attacker if you do eventually want to attack with that. Whereas Zapdos really doesn't fix any bad matchups for you. So I don't think you're playing this in something like Urshifu. And there's other random things still lingering in the format like Galarian Surfetched. But I guess in theory, you could attempt to use this as some sort of pseudo energy acceleration engine or other stuff, maybe like Sandaconda VMAX or the new Lycanroc VMAX. But I mean, none of these things are very impactful combos that I'm sort of illustrating here. The best application for Zapdos is going to be in the context of Rapid Strike Urshifu, but as already mentioned, Moltres is just kind of better. So as you guys can tell by my rating, I'm really not a big fan of the Zapdos. Pretty bad at the moment, but there is a world where it does find a home far in the future once we get some other fighting Pokemon to pair with it. Next up, we have Medicham V. This is going to be a new Rapid Strike card. And while it does have a second attack that can hit for 100, I really just want to focus in on this first attack here. For 2 colorless energy, or just a Rapid Strike energy, you put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. If your opponent's Pokemon is knocked out by this attack at the end of your turn, you can take another turn, and this attack can't be used if any of your Pokemon use this attack on your last turn. Yeah, getting to take an extra turn is absolutely insane. Like, it's very rare that we get cards that do that, and I think one of the last ones that really saw any play was Dialga GX. And even in the case of that, the attack needed like 5 energy, and it was the card's GX attack, meaning you could only use this effect once per game. You know, in theory with Medicham, you can use this a couple times throughout the course of a game, which is kind of wild. Now, of course, the issue, as you guys can see, though, is the fact that your opponent needs to be literally just 1 to 2 damage counters away from being knocked out. But to be honest, I don't think it's that big of a deal. And the reason I say that is when I'm thinking about Rapid Strike Urshifu, there's so many different times when I've played the card where the math for its attack is kind of awkward and doesn't quite finish off things in a way that I like. And we've seen people play other things like Telescopic Sight, Passimian, or even Inteleon to help fix that a little bit. And this is where I think Medicham really can slot nicely into potentially some sort of Rapid Strike deck out there. Just to give it an easy example of how this might work out in practice, use GMAX Rapid Flow with a Telescopic Sight. To do 150 to a Crobat V, use Inteleon to place 2 damage counters, and then you can use Medicham to come in on the following turn, knock that out, and gain yourself another turn in the process. And I think when you are able to pull this off, it's going to feel absolutely insane. You know, unless you're already massively behind in the game, I can't help but feel that, like, if you get off this attack even once successfully, you're going to be in a good spot to close out the game. So Medicham V, I think this is a pretty solid card. It's definitely a card you're only going to need probably 1 copy of, and it is going to be somewhat select when you're able to pull off this attack, but it's searchable by Quick Ball, just needs 1 attachment and you can pull this off and hopefully steal yourself another turn in the process. So really cool card. I am a fan of this one. Next up, we're checking out Lycanroc VMAX. Not a whole lot to really say about the pre-evolution, to be honest, so let's just jump right to the VMAX. 320 HP, Grass Weakness, 1 Retreat cost. And his first attack says for a Fighting Energy, you choose one of your opponent's Pokemon and play with 60 HP or less remaining. That Pokemon is now knocked out. And its other attack for Fighting Colorist is 190 and 30 to 1 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So while I'm generally not too enthusiastic about Lycanroc, I think this first attack is actually kind of interesting, because if you go first in a game and you're playing to get something with maybe an Inteleon engine, on your second turn, you can evolve and just for a single Fighting Energy instantly knock out like a Sobble somewhere on your opponent's field, or maybe like a Rowlet as an example too, or something like that if you're going against any other 1 prize focused decks. I think one of the big things too that comes to mind is this could be a nice way at finishing off Pokemon without needing boss's orders. But unfortunately, I actually don't think that's going to come up too often if I'm just being honest. Primarily because we're losing tag team Pokemon and the math doesn't really work out in a way usually to get your opponent's Pokemon VMAX to that HP range. Because if we look at Max Edge, we're doing 190, which kind of comfortably 2-shots Pokemon right in smack dab in the middle of their HP. I think it's going to be difficult to actually get them to below 60 if you wanted to be able to use this first attack to clean up a knockout. Whereas something like Tag Team Pokemon doing 190 plus maybe a 30 snipe actually does set up the math for you in a way that you could use this attack. And without tag teams being around, your only options really for this attack are maybe like on Zacian V, or like I mentioned, low HP unevolved basics. And if this first attack is kind of situational, its second attack really is not going to make a good case to play this card. You know, like I mentioned, it's a comfortable 2-shotting attack that we have here. It is nice that Mew has been rotated, so your 30 damage is not going to be stopped, which means you can actually play something like Telescopic Sight if you want to double down on that as well. But an issue with a card like this is that it's kind of clunky to power up. You know, if you do want to power this thing up, you're going to have to play something like Colossal, Rose, or maybe something like the new Galarian Zapdos with energy switches. And if we're jumping through all of those hoops, only to kind of two-shot things in a kind of very average way, I think there's just much better cards that we could play to play the two-shot game. So for that reason, guys, I do have to pass on Lycanroc. I think this card's just a little too clunky to actually see a lot of play. Alrighty guys, next up we have the last of the Galarian bird trio for Evolving Skies, and that's going to be Galarian Moltres. And if you've paid attention to the other two, you'll probably be able to guess what the ability on this is going to be. Whenever we bench Moltres from hand, we can attach 2 Dark Energies from hand as well to it. And then its attack is actually, I think, probably the best of the 3 birds. This one is Dark Colorless, does 20 plus 50 more for each prize card your opponent has already taken. I do think Moltres does compete a little bit with Galarian Moltres V for deck space. But there are, I think, a couple of pros to this baby Galarian Moltres over the V. Of course, the big one is that Path to the Peak is not going to shut this thing down. So you will be able to use this even under ability lock. Also, this Galarian Moltres is going to allow you to bench this and accelerate energy even when you don't have energy in the discard pile yet. So there's definitely turns where I think both of these have their pros and cons. And decks like Eternatus and Rapid Strike Urshifu have both played cards like Scoop Up Net throughout their time in the game, and a card like Galarian Moltres does nicely pair with a card like Scoop Up Net and Energy Switch. But I think the one thing that kind of does make me slightly more neutral on this card compared to downvoting it for its redundancy with Galarian Moltres V is the fact that this attack is actually kind of decent, especially when compared to the other birds that we checked out already. You know, I think the math for this is a little bit awkward in the post-rotation format since we won't actually be able to one-shot tag teams anymore, since obviously tag teams will have been rotated, but it is possible to do 270 with this Galarian Moltres out of nowhere while only giving up 1 prize in the process, which actually could make a difference if your opponent is at like 4 prizes instead of 5, because obviously this thing is pretty easy to KO. But if you can even do 220 with this thing, if you're playing a deck that 2-shots things already, I think you're going to get your worth out of this card. So Galarian Moltres V has proven itself to be very, very good, and I don't think this is going to outshine that card by any means, but as I mentioned, I think there are certain situations where this could be marginally better, again, in very select instances. So for that reason, I'm not going to completely downvote this card, but I would caution people that the Galarian Moltres V is still probably a little bit better than this. Alrighty, next up we have the final of the Eeveelution VMAXs that we're going to be taking a look at in this set, and we definitely saved the best one for last, and that's going to be Umbreon VMAX. So while I don't think Umbreon V itself is particularly groundbreaking, I do think its second attack is decent at least. You know, if you power this thing up with Houndoom, you can hit for 160, and that's excluding your single strike energies. So I actually kind of do like this second attack, which could maybe situationally come in handy from time to time. But of course, Umbreon VMAX is going to be the star of the show here, mainly for this ability. Whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active. And then its only attack for Dark 2 Colorless does 160. So yeah, this ability, absolutely insane. This ability is identical to several different powerful cards we've had over the years, mainly Luxray level X, and more recently, Lycanroc GX back from Guardians Rising. Both cards seeing tons of play throughout their lifespan, and Umbreon VMAX is going to be no different in this case either, I think. So obviously the big partner for this is going to be Eternatus VMAX. Eternatus already just wants good bench sitters already, so after you've used this ability, even though you can't reuse it, Umbreon is still sitting on your bench, powering up your attacks with Eternatus VMAX. And also, I actually think there's a world where we can potentially build around Umbreon as an attacker too. So if we just look at this, 160 doesn't seem like anything crazy, but again, we are a single strike Pokemon, meaning that we can actually increase our damage output to make sure we can 2-shot anything in the game. And with 1 single strike energy, that's actually enough to knock out bench sitters like Crobat V and Eldegoss V. So if you're playing like a 4/4 Umbreon and maybe some copies of Echoing Horn, there is a world where I could see you just knocking out the same Crobat multiple times to win a game with this thing. So I'm almost kind of willing to sacrifice a little bit of damage output to make sure I can attack into exactly what I want every single turn. And there is also a new Pokemon tool card that is exclusive to Espeon and Umbreon VMAX that prevents things like Boss's Orders from affecting them while they are safely on your bench. So I think that's another way where a designated Umbreon VMAX deck could work. You could play some of these tool cards to make sure your damaged Umbreons stay out of harm's way while you attack every turn with a fresh one. So those are the two main ways I'm currently thinking about Umbreon, but also too, I think Umbreon has the potential to even pop up in other decks that are reliant on specific supporters every turn. So think of something like Melanie based decks. They usually want to use Melanie most turns of the game to keep accelerating energy. Sometimes it can be hard to find a turn where you can take a break to play a Boss's Orders. Umbreon might allow you a way at getting around that, So Umbreon, this is definitely, I think, one of the best cards in the set. I would say even maybe like top 3 for me right now. So yeah, absolutely insane card. Definitely get this. It's unfortunately probably going to be a little expensive because not only is it competitive, but it's also a highly collectible Eeveelution as well. But yeah, definitely going to be, I think, a very good card coming out of Evolving Skies. Alright guys, next up we have another Dark Pokemon VMAX. That is going to be Garbodor VMAX, which is actually, I think, a really interesting card overall. Whether it's good or not, that's a different story, but this ability is really cool. This Pokemon can have up to 2 Pokemon tools attached to it, and if this ability stops working, discard tools until there is only 1 left. And its only attack here for Dark Colorist is 120, and your opponent's active is now poisoned and can't retreat during your opponent's next turn. So we've seen a few abilities like this over the years. Some of the more recent examples that come to mind for me are going to be Genesect GX and also the Sigilyph back from the Plasma era of the game. And Sigilyph in particular did actually see play in sort of a rogue tool-based deck. So there is some degree of precedent for Garbodor here to be decent. So if this attack is bad, which it definitely is, how are we using this ability? Is this ability going to be used to sort of make up the difference in damage for this attack? Is it going to be used to disrupt our opponent? For me, one of the big cards that comes to mind is going to be the Whimsicott from Vivid Voltage. That's one of my favorite single prize cards that exists right now. It is kind of a shame we are losing U-turn board. Otherwise, this would actually be a really sick inclusion for that deck. And I'll at least still try that out to see how it does. But in the case of Whimsicott, you do more damage for every tool card that you discard, so having maybe a Garbodor or 2 in play means that you can discard more tools, doing more damage. But beyond Whimsicott, if we're trying to play something like Garbodor on its own, I really don't think the solution here is to necessarily try to play cards that sort of make up for your lack of damage. Like, it is cool, you could play the different glove cards, or you could have like multiple Rocky helmets just as an example, but I think that's getting a little bit too gimmicky with your damage output, because otherwise, guys, if you're a Dark Pokemon VMAX that attacks for 2 energy, just play Eternatus. It's way more consistent, hits for up to 270, and it's just all around a proven archetype. So I think if Garbodor were to be played, it would be in a way that is much more disruptive and defensive. So think of the new Spirit Mask card, I believe it is, that we're getting in this set that can discard cards from your hand whenever your opponent attacks into you. I think stuff like that is more in line with what I am expecting out of Garbodor. These in general are sort of the strategies that I can maybe expect from Garbodor. So this is a card that I really don't think is very good, but I'm almost hesitant to say this card is bad because I think there is a lot of potential for some sort of disruption archetype, maybe based around the new Spirit Mask or Rugged Helmet. Like, I just can't help but think that I'm going to say this card is bad. And then a couple sets from now, there's going to be a deck with Garbodor VMAX and these different disruptive tool cards, and it's going to destroy me, and I'm going to be mad about having said this card is bad. But I have to give this rating kind of based on what we have in the format now. And right after post-rotation, I'm not expecting a whole lot from Garbodor. So I'm going to commit to saying it's bad, but I could see a world where that changes just because of the inevitable possibilities that being able to have multiple tool cards does open up. So next up we have a new Zoroark card. This one is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, and it has this ability. Once during your turn, you may choose a Stage 1 Pokemon from your discard pile, excluding Zoroark, then discard this Pokemon and all cards attached to it and put the Pokemon you chose in its place. And then its only attack for 2 colorless energy does a flat 70. So very clearly, we are not even remotely interested in this attack. But this ability, I remember, actually did cause a good bit of conversation when this card was initially revealed. Saw a lot of hype for this thing, with people drawing lots of comparisons to Ditto Prism Star back from Lost Thunder. But I don't think this card is anywhere near as good as Ditto Prism Star. Basically, Zoroark and Ditto both kind of act as a way to get a 5th evolution into play. Like, let's say you're playing a 4/4 Altaria, well, suddenly Zoroark gives you a way at getting a 5th one into play immediately. Because let's say your 4th Altaria gets knocked out, you have Zoroark in play, you can activate this ability and turn this into an Altaria, just as an easy example. And that kind of is the same sort of role that Ditto had. But this is a Stage 1, guys. But another issue about this compared to Ditto is that also you have to already have the Pokemon in the discard pile, whereas Ditto could just evolve as normal with its ability. So not only do you have to set up a Stage 1, but also now you have to go through the extra hassle of discarding the Pokemon you actually might want to transform into. This is very much just so the whole meme of, hey mom, I went Ditto Prism Star, we have Ditto Prism Star at home. And this is what it is. But I will say one of the areas where Zoroark might have some potential in the early days of this new post-rotation format is the fact that we don't have Mew. And what I mean by that is if you're like a one prize stage 1 deck, let's say we're playing the new Raichu and Flaffy from this set. Easy example to understand here. If you're playing against a Rapid Strike Urshifu, they could easily G-Max Rapid Flow knock out both your Flaffys or both your Raichus. But if you have something like a Zoroark on the field, if your opponent does target down, let's say both of your attackers, or alternatively both of your energy accelerators, well, now you actually have a way at shape-shifting back into one of those cards that just got knocked out. So, I mean, this is definitely not a replacement from you by any means, but it does sort of mitigate some of the worst effects that Urshifu can cause to your board if you are like a single prize stage 1 deck. And speaking of Altaria, which I kind of mentioned earlier, I think one of my favorite potential plays with this card is if you are a deck that's playing Zoroark, you probably want to run like maybe 1 to 2 Altaria. That way, if you get into a point where your opponent does trap themselves into having a board that can't deal with an Altaria, you can easily just shape shift, shut your opponent out of the game. So it's not that there's no way to make use of Zoroark, but I think most of the time there's other ways you could better use these, at minimum, 2 spots you are dedicating to your list for this. You know, if you want a 5th attacker, cut Zoroark, play just another copy of Ornate Rod, and now you have another deck space open as well. Another issue with this compared to Ditto Prism Star is that you actually can't preemptively power this thing up to be able to transform into something, because you do have to discard all of the cards attached to it when you do activate this ability. So that is another limitation, which kind of means you can basically only use this with cards that have abilities or might just attack for a single attachment. So guys, I respect this ability. I'm leaning very heavily to being neutral on this card because I think just by its very nature, it has potential. But I think this thing just seems like more trouble than it's worth. And it's like almost more into the gimmicky territory than being like an actual genuinely good versatile card. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at a new Thievul card, and it feels like we've had a ton of cards with this Pokemon, but none of them have really stuck up until this point. But I think this one is at least like the most interesting Thievul we've seen in the TCG so far. But the ability here says when you play this from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may have each player shuffle their hand and put it at the bottom of their deck. Then each player draws 4 cards, and then kind of an irrelevant 60 damage attack. So clearly, this ability is what people have kind of been talking about whenever this card got revealed. And it's basically kind of like a Marnie built into a coming into play ability. And a lot of people were kind of making comparisons to Marshadow from Shining Legends. And much like with the last Stage 1 Dark Pokemon we looked at, this is definitely nowhere near as good as its predecessor that it has had comparisons drawn to. This is just as close to Let Loose Marshadow as Zoroark is as close to Ditto Prism Star. Not very. Yeah, this is substantially worse being a stage 1, but I will at least point out some of the things I do like about this. The big thing is that you can use this under Path to the Peak. So for example, if you are an Eternatus VMAX player, you could in theory make a draw engine based around Thievul's instead of Crobats, especially maybe if Galarian Zapdos V is giving you a lot of trouble. This is a way to sort of cut down on your Pokemon V that you have in play to make sure Zapdos can't attack as easily. And if you're playing Scoop Up Nets, this is an ability you can at least reuse over and over. But most of the time, I'm thinking I'm just playing Crobat V. You know, it's a basic. You can just quick ball for it, slap it down, and you get to draw more cards. Now, I know the disruption aspect doesn't exist with Crobat V, and that might be where Thievul might see some play one day, but just in terms of being a stage 1 consistency booster, this is not near the top of my list. I think the only deck you would really consider this in as a draw engine would be Eternatus. Otherwise, you would just play something like Cincino, which you can use every single turn, or an Inteleon engine, which allows you to search for very specific cards and gives you a good stage 2 to evolve into after you've already used the ability on Drizzile. So again, I think the disruption aspect could be something that players might mess around with eventually. I'm going to be honest, I'm not a control player, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about ideas in regards to that. But if this card does ever see any play, I think it'll be squarely sort of in that realm. So yeah, non-supporter based draw is typically good, but Thievul is kind of outclassed by some of the other stage 1 consistency boosters that we already have in the format. So it's going to be a pass for me. Alrighty guys, next up we're finally going to be checking out the Dragon type Pokemon of Evolving Skies. The first one is going to be Dragonite V. Which I do want to point out, the regular art is not actually technically in the set. It's going to be in a box, but the full art and special full art versions, I do believe still are going to be included in Evolving Skies. But Dragonite is going to be a basic Pokemon, 230 HP, of course, no weakness or resistance, and a 3 retreat cost. And its first attack for 2 colorless energy does 50, and this attack is not affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. And its other attack for 2 water and a lightning does 250 and does 20 to each of your benched Pokemon. So being able to hit through effects on your opponent's active is a good attribute to have. That means you can get through things like Decidueye, Glaceon VMAX, Zamazenta V, but unfortunately the damage output isn't really high enough to, I think, sufficiently tech against these sort of cards. That only leaves us with the second attack, and 250 is a decent amount of damage to hit for, don't get it misconstrued, but I think you're really going to have to jump through some hoops here to get something like Dragonite V powered up. It is a Pokemon V, so that does mean Melanie will work with this, but if your only Dragonite gets knocked out and you have to set up another one, Melanie's only accelerating 1 energy. I really think you're going to need some other way at powering this thing up, maybe like Turbo Patch or Raihan or Frostlash, just as a couple of easy examples. Unfortunately, because this is a dragon type, Frostmoth will not work, so that's why we are going to have to sort of look at some of these other options that we have in the game. But you guys have heard me make this comparison in the past. If we are a basic Pokemon attacking for 3 energy, why on earth would we not just be using Zacian V? You know, the difference between 250 and 220 is pretty negligible. Zacian is easy to power up with Metal Saucer, has an amazing ability. Dragonite has neither of those luxuries, unfortunately. And really, I'd almost argue that the difference between 250 and 180 doesn't even matter that much. Because really, this attack is not ever taking one-shots. And if we just need to 2-shot stuff, all we really need to do is actually technically 170 to be able to 2-shot any VMAX in the game. And there's just cards that do a much better, efficient job that can power themselves up much easier and less clunky than Dragonite. So next one, guys, we have ourselves a new Altaria that we're going to be checking out. But we're looking at this thing for its ability. Once during your turn, you may search your deck for a supporter card and reveal it, shuffle the rest of your deck, and put that supporter card on top of your deck. Okay, so we've had effects kind of like this over the years. I think one of the last ones that really was kind of similar to this was the Smooth Over Magcargo back from Celestial Storm. Now, Magcargo was, I think, a little bit better since it could search for any card, but I think still searching for a supporter is good enough to excite me for this Altaria, because supporter cards really do range in terms of their function. You can grab a Professor's Research to bail yourself out of a dead hand. You can put a Boss's Orders on top of your deck to maybe gust something up for a knockout. You can maybe put a Melanie on top of your deck to accelerate energies. So I think even though this is limited to just one type of trainer card, I think those trainer cards frequently have a wide ranging of effects that you could potentially get. And we have a lot of ways at still drawing into the card that we put on top of our deck. I think the Primate Wisdom Oranger is going to be the main one that really comes to my mind immediately, because you can, of course, put a supporter on top of your deck, then replace a card in your hand with that top deck that you just placed there. That's an easy thing to do. But then we also have other sort of draw engines like Cincino still, with its Make Do ability to draw 2 cards. And we're also getting the new Suicune V that we just took a look at earlier in this set review as well, that has an ability that can allow you to draw a card if it's your active Pokemon. And a lot of times, even if you don't need a supporter that turn, sometimes it could be nice if you maybe played a Professor's Research already for turn and you don't have a supporter to follow up on the next turn. Sometimes just playing an ability like this to guarantee that you can draw into a supporter on your next turn is good enough, even if you don't need it on that specific turn. But one of the things that I like the most about Altaria is that it actually opens your deck up to be able to use supporter cards that are usually a little bit more situational, and you typically might not want to run in very high counts like your Professor Researches of the world and stuff like that. Just as a couple of easy examples, think of something like Flannery, Team Yellgrunt, maybe the new Raihan. I think that's really one thing that the game has been lacking a lot of ever since the rotation of Tapu Lele GX. A lot of these more niche situational supporters have really been kind of awkward to attempt to play in your deck a lot of the time. And I think Altaria gives a lot of those cards a shot at being able to see play again. So as you guys can tell, I am a pretty big fan of this Altaria. I think this is a really solid little consistency boosting card. And I think there's a pretty good chance that this Altaria will see some play. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Salamence, which is one of the only Stage 2 Pokemon I want to point out that is actually in this set review. We haven't looked at too many here, but this one is a kind of a neat card, 170 HP, and it has this ability: once during your turn, you may have your opponent switch their active with one of their benched Pokemon. And its only attack here for a fire and water does 100, and if your opponent's active already has any damage counters on it, this attack does 120 more. So I actually think both this ability and this attack are kind of decent. You know, in the case of this ability, even though you don't actually get to choose what ends up coming into the active spot, I still like this ability because I think a lot of times with stage 2 decks in particular, every turn you're basically kind of trying to combo yourself into your next stage 2, which usually means you have to play a draw supporter or search supporter for turn. And a lot of times it can be difficult to find a turn to take off where you can play something like a boss's orders instead. So this at least gives you some way at gusting, even on those turns where you are forced to play other supporters to keep up in the game. The attack also not too bad as well. Hitting 220 I think is a pretty decent number. That's gonna one-shot pretty much any viable 2-prize Pokemon that is in the game. And of course that can 2-shot 3-prize Pokemon. But as you guys can tell by my rating, I do still have some concerns about Salamence. So like I've said a few times throughout this set review, it is kind of unfortunate we don't have any good bench protection in the post-rotation format just yet, because Rapid Strike Urshifu's G-Max Rapid Flow can really wreak havoc on these sorts of slower setup-based decks. But also, even though I think the damage to energy ratio for this attack is pretty good, I think it sometimes can be difficult to chain these fully powered Salamences every single turn. Because basically every time a Salamence goes down, you're going to need a manual attachment for turn, plus some other way at accelerating energy. So there's definitely a few ideas you could try out with Salamence. There's things like EXP Share, Frostlass, or maybe even the new Raihan supporter card, which definitely could pair nicely with Salamence. I think that one in particular does have some potential here, just because not only can it accelerate in energy when something gets knocked out, but you also get any other card that you want out of your deck, meaning that you can grab that rare candy that you need to evolve, you can grab that evolution incense to grab your Salamence, whatever it might be. So that definitely seems like a natural partner for a deck like this, but the issue with that card is you can only play it when something gets knocked out. So a lot of times I imagine your early game having a lot of these in your deck might make your Salamence deck a little bit clunky in the early stages of the game before you get going, which even further compounds its issues going against bench snipers like Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. So it hurts me to say it, but I think I'm going to pass on Salamence. I really do like this card. It's a stage 2, so obviously I want to like this thing. I want stage 2s to be viable. But I think the issues that Salamence does have are just slightly too big to outweigh the pros to a card like this. Alright, so next up we finally got to the big daddy himself, Rayquaza VMAX, the mascot, or one of the main mascots at least, of the new Evolving Sky set. Let's take a look at this thing. Rayquaza V I think is worth highlighting as well. Rayquaza V has Dragon Pulse for a lightning energy, does 40 damage, and you discard the top 2 cards of your deck. But then its other attack for a fire and lightning, you may discard up to 2 basic fire or basic lightning energy from this Pokemon, and the attack does 20 plus 80 more for each energy you discard in this way, meaning that you cap out at 180, which actually isn't too bad. You can 2-shot Pokemon VMAX and also 1-shot some of those consistency boosting support Pokemon like Crobat, Eldegoss, etc. So not an awful base form V, which is actually a little bit unusual most of the time. But Rayquaza VMAX definitely going to be the star of the show here. It is going to be a Rapid Strike Pokemon, much like its pre-evolution, 320 HP, no weakness, 2 retreat cost. Then it has this ability, once during your turn you may discard all cards from your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. And then its attack is actually very similar to Rayquaza V, but you have no damage cap. So if we just run through the math with this attack, if we discard 4 energy, that's going to be 320 damage plus the 20 base damage, totaling up to 340, knocking out any VMAX that is currently seeing play in the game. You know, things do change a little bit once you start thinking about big charms or other HP modifiers, but outside of that, Rayquaza is going to be able to nuke anything in its path, which is what makes it such an exciting card. And while prior to Evolving Skies, there wasn't really a great way at getting this thing powered up, you guys know we are getting the new Flaffy to keep accelerating lightning energy that we discard every time that we attack with Rayquaza here. So this archetype sort of builds itself. It's very similar to the old Rayquaza Electric deck from the 2012 era of the game. The ability, I think, is one of the best parts of Rayquaza VMAX, just being able to dump your hand, draw 3. This stacks, so if you do have 2 to 3 of these Rayquaza VMAX in play, you know, if you need that boss's orders to close out the game and you don't have it in hand, you can keep digging with these abilities. Also, of course, we can pitch away energy in the process to get back out with Flaffy. And even outside of Flappy, I think Rayquaza VMAX finally might make the best case for Rose that we've seen thus far. You know, Rose up until now has been kind of a lackluster supporter, primarily because it makes you discard your entire hand and it's your supporter for turn. which after you use it kind of brings the pace of your deck to a screeching halt. But with something like Rayquaza VMAX having this great ability built right into the card, we can play something like Rose, then actually keep drawing cards and get us out of that dead hand that Rose puts you into otherwise. So I think that could be another way at powering up your Rayquazas, especially since we are losing Mew. Your Flappies are definitely going to be in more danger of Rapid Strike Urshifu than pre-rotation. And speaking of your bench with this deck, we have a new Stadium card coming out that can get either a Lightning or a Dragon basic Pokemon, put it on your bench. So that definitely seems like a strong Stadium for this deck, and also can act as a good path to the peak counter as well. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is Rayquaza VMAX being a Rapid Strike Pokemon. And largely speaking, I don't think being a Rapid Strike Pokemon makes too much of a difference. I think where you might be able to see Rayquaza take advantage of this is maybe potentially with some of the tool cards to give Rapid Strike Pokemon extra attacks. Or maybe even this could open you up to playing a copy of Zeraora V in your deck as well, since both Rayquaza and Zeraora attack for the same energy. But beyond that, guys, I don't think there's really a whole lot to get excited about in terms of this being a Rapid Strike card. We're not using Rapid Strike energy or Spiral energy or any of that stuff. But even though I am choosing to upvote this card, I do worry about it being so reliant on Flaffy in a format that Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX looks to be able to take great advantage of because of the lack of Mew. So because of that, I actually think there is a chance Rayquaza might not even become like a tier 1 archetype or anything like that. But I have to imagine if you're playing against anything else that isn't Rapid Strike Urshifu, Rayquaza is going to be in a really good spot to be able to just take one-shots on anything that gets in its path. So I'm still a big fan of Rayquaza, and I expect this to still be one of the most impactful cards that we're going to be getting out of this set. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Kyurem. Kyurem is going to be a basic Pokemon, 120 HP, 2 retreat cost, and it has 1 attack for 2 water and a metal. You discard any amount of water energy from your Pokemon, and this attack is 60 for each card you discarded in this way. So Kyurem is almost kind of like a spiritual successor to the Turtonator from Dragon Majesty, but it's actually a little bit stronger because this is a 60 times multiplier compared to Turtonator's 50. And at a glance, I think this card seems like a decent one prize card. It has an unlimited damage cap with a ton of different ways at powering this thing up. That's also still my issue with this card. And what I mean by that is it's really unfortunate that cards like Melanie or Frostmoth don't work with Kyurem, leaving us with a combination of much less reliable ways at getting energy into play. In terms of Pokemon, we have Frostlass and Trumbeak. I think those are going to be some of the 2 bigger ways at getting energy into play. You know, Trumbeak can potentially get you 3 energy, but its ability is much less reliable, whereas Frostlass has some natural synergy with Kyurem, getting energy out of the discard pile. And even though Melanie won't work with Kyurem, there are still a few trainer cards that come to mind for a card like this. EXP Share, Turbo Patch, and the new Raihan are going to be, I think, some of your better options. But the issue with all these cards I'm talking about, guys, is that Kyurem really wants a ton of energy into play every turn. And if you just discarded 5 or 6 energy, to get another 5 or 6 energy into play is honestly too big of a challenge for these cards that sometimes only accelerate a single energy at a time. So honestly, I think just reliably accelerating energy is too big of a challenge right now for this card. This is actually a card that could really turn around quickly though if we ever get any more powerful energy acceleration that could work with this. But right now, this card just does not have the partner to do such a thing. So next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Umbreon V, which I'm personally really excited for. I think Umbreon is one of the sickest dragon Pokemon that exist. I think there's some cool stuff you can do with this card, but yeah. You guys can tell by my rating, I think competitively we have some issues to kind of talk about here today. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the base stats on this thing. 200 HP, 0 weakness of course, but the 0 retreat cost is also going to be really nice. But it has 2 attacks. The first one for a single psychic energy does 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. And of course, you never apply weakness and resistance for bench Pokemon, which is also hilarious because Dragon can't hit anything for weakness. And then its other attack for a psychic and dark does 60 plus 120 if you and your opponent have the same number of cards in your hand. So there are definitely things I like about both these attacks, and also in conjunction with one another as well. So the first attack being just a single energy is nice because, you know, if we go second on our turn 1, we can actually slap down a telescopic sight and a psychic energy and immediately start spreading with Umbreon V, which does have some degree of appeal. And I think if you do choose to go with a designated spread strategy with Umbreon, I think there's actually quite a few cards that could help this thing out. I think you could probably just double down on other ways at slowing your opponent down to your pace of play with things like Path to the Peak, Crushing Hammer, etc. And basically just try to slow down your opponent just enough to where they aren't going to be able to put on a ton of pressure onto your Noivern V. But one of the issues I think these sorts of strategies have had in the past is very frequently it can be difficult to close out a game. Like a lot of times with spread decks, you can do a ton of damage, but a lot of stuff will also be just narrowly out of range at being knocked out. And I think the second attack on Noivern V does a decent job at attempting to fix that. Sometimes spread decks of the past have to play other separate backup attackers if they do want to have a big attack out of nowhere. But Noivern V, just for one extra energy, at some point you can maybe do 180 and clean up a knockout after you've been spreading for a few turns. So I actually do like the second attack, and it does look like we are getting Copycat getting reprinted in this set as well. So we do have a supporter to put both players at the same hand size. But even outside of Copycat, there's still ways at manipulating your hand size to meet this requirement when you do need it. So in terms of my issues with this card, the first one is going to be the damage from Boom Burst. I really wish this was just ever so slightly higher, maybe like a 30 spread. I think that would be a little bit more fair. And the other issue I have with Noivern is the fact that it's a multi-prize Pokemon. You know, when we were talking about the new Raichu earlier in this set review, I mentioned you can actually probably get off maybe 5 attacks with Raichu before the game ends. But with Noivern, your opponent only needs to knock out 3 of these to win, which might actually put you on a little bit more of a clock as opposed to had Noivern been a single prize Pokemon. So I think if you do ever want to build around Noivern, I think Noivern is going to require some degree of disruption just to be able to keep your opponent from taking one-shots on you. Again, that's where things like Path to the Peak, Crushing Hammer, etc. can come in handy. And Noivern does have a lot of other ways at compounding its damage output and spread strategies. You know, of course, we have Zigzagoons with Scoop Up Nets, we have Flapple, we have actually the Inteleon evolution line. I think that's actually one of the more appealing ways I would consider building around Noivern. So yeah, I actually think there's a ton of cards that make sense with Noivern, but I just worry your Noiverns are not going to be able to stay around long enough to actually close out a game. And God forbid your opponent plays anyways at healing in their deck. That would also be awful as well. So unfortunately, I think competitively this card is a little bit shy of where it needs to be. Probably won't see much of it at your next tournament or online event. Alright guys, next up we have a new Flapple card. This is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, 80 HP. That is, of course, always important to point out since that will make this entire evolution line level ball searchable. Has a 1 retreat and 2 attacks here. The first one for a colorless energy does 50 times the number of your opponent's Pokemon in play with an ability. And its other attack for a grass and fire. If your opponent's active is a Pokemon V, this attack does 80 more damage. So if the first attack looks familiar, it actually probably should. This is basically just Weavile from Ultra Prism. And Weavile actually was a card that did see a fair bit of play as time went on. So automatically right there is some precedent set for this attack to be decent. We have a ton of abilities in the format right now. We have Crobat V, Drizzile, and Inteleon, Eternatus, Galarian Moltres V, the list goes on and on. Now I do want to point out though, Weavile came out in a much different era of the game in terms of HPs. You know, at the time, the highest amount of HP on any sort of popular Pokemon was around 230, 240 HP, but now we have VMAXs running around with 100 more HP than that, meaning this attack I don't think is quite as aged as well as I would have liked. I really do wish this would have been like 60 times multiplier. That would have made me a lot happier to see, but nevertheless, theoretically 300 for 1 energy attachment is really good still. So I still like this attack, and its second attack isn't awful either. I do want to point out, doing 160 for 2, not the worst energy to damage ratio in the world, but of course I do think its first attack is going to be the one that is a little bit more impactful. But really, I just don't know what deck I would play this in, if I'm just being honest guys. This really isn't like a main attacker sort of card. This is something you're probably playing as like a 2-2 or a 3-3 line of in some other deck. I don't know if there's ever going to be like a Zoroark toolbox deck that pops up. Appleton seems like a decent candidate for some sort of deck like that. Or also now, I think we are at a point where we have a good bit of Stage 1 Pokemon that can attack for a single energy. So maybe Flapple finds its way into some sort of Aurora energy-based toolbox out there. And my rating sort of reflects this, guys. I like this card, but I really just don't have a clear deck idea in mind when talking about this thing yet. So who knows? It might not even see much play from the get-go, but I think this first attack is still good enough to where Flapple could catch on and be a backup attacker for some deck at some point. So next up we have the other Applin evolution, that is going to be Appleton. And while its second attack is identical to the Flapple we just looked at, this first attack is going to be a little bit different. So for a colorless energy, to 70 times the amount of special energy attached to your opponent's Pokemon. So while the damage multiplier on this attack is actually a little bit higher than the one we just looked at on Flapple, I think it's actually very unlikely you're ever going to hit above 200 with a card like this. I just don't think there's going to be too many decks out there that have their entire energy line built around special energies. And debatably the most popular deck that plays Special Energy, Rapid Strike Urshifu, is on average only going to have 2 Special Energy in play, but a lot of the times whenever they attach their energy, they're also discarding it when they attack. And at that point, this attack is not really doing a whole lot. We'll have to keep our eyes on the format as time goes on because, there is definitely a world where more special energy catches on and we see a lot more decks in the format play these sorts of things. But without that, that kind of just relegates Appleton to being a tech Pokemon against the few decks that play special energy. And like I mentioned, the ones that do, don't play enough to really fuel this attack. Or when they do attach their special energy, they're discarding it half the time. So yeah, this Appleton is pretty much straight garbage, guys. I don't like this card at all. I definitely think Flapple is the superior Applin evolution that we're getting in this set. Alrighty guys, for the final Pokemon VMAX of the set review, we're going to be taking a look at Duraludon VMAX. Duraludon's going to clock in at 330 HP, 3 retreat cost, and of course, like the other dragons, no weakness or resistance. And this is also a single strike Pokemon, which could be important to keep in mind potentially. So for Duraludon VMAX, it has this ability, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from each of your opponent's Pokemon that has any special energy attached to it. And its only attack for a fighting and 2 metal does 220, and this attack's damage isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. Being able to wall against Pokemon with special energy has been a good ability in the past. One of the big ones that comes to mind for me is going to be Aegislash EX. And we've seen cards like that actually do pretty well in the past. And this attack, even though it's not taking giant one-shots on anything, 220 is still a 2-shotting amount of damage, and being able to cut through things like Decidueye, Zamazenta V, Glaceon VMAX, etc. is a good utility to have as well. So I actually do like both the ability and the attack here, but I think my issue for Duraludon VMAX is largely going to be its attack cost. So even though at a glance it seems like there are actually a few different ways at powering this thing up, I think all of them are kind of clunky if I'm just being honest. So we see the metal energy and its attack cost, which might bring to mind, okay, we can play Metal Saucer, but of course Metal Saucer is just for metal Pokemon. Now, luckily, there is a Metal Duraludon V in the format, so we can Metal Saucer to that. But needing to Metal Saucer to your pre-evolution before you evolve definitely seems something a little bit sus to me. I'm not too big on that. I have seen some people talk about maybe playing Bronzong to always sort of serve as that Metal Saucer target. That seems okay as well, I guess. But now you're eating up like 4 to 6 spots in your deck just because you can't saucer to your main attacker. Duraludon VMAX, being a single strike Pokemon, also does open it up to being able to use Houndoom with it as well. But in the case of Houndoom, I think that gets a little bit awkward because single strike energy only covers one of the 3 energies in this attack cost. Had maybe 2 of these energies been fighting, then maybe I think we'd have a different story on our hands. Because then you could, in theory, use 2 single strike roars and then just attach once from hand to get your Duraludons powered up. But unfortunately, that's not the case, leaving you with still needing to cheat 2 more energies into play, even after you've accelerated 1 with Houndoom. And at that point, one of the only other ways I can really think to power this up is Rose, and you guys have seen how popular Rose has been up until now. And unlike something like Rayquaza, this doesn't have a great ability built in to sort of mitigate the downsides of playing something like Rose. So I'm just looking around at all of this card's ways of accelerating energy, and I'm just kind of scratching in my head, are any of these really worth it? Because also, even though this ability is good, the only deck it's really shutting out, or at least increasing your odds against, is going to be Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. Some other decks do play special energies from time to time, but largely speaking, most every deck is primarily reliant on basic energies. And at that point, if you're only really walling out one deck in the format, this is largely just going to be a clunky way at 2-shotting most other decks in the game. Now, of course, not having weakness is something that is really nice for Duraludon compared to some of the other VMAXs that we have in the game right now. But even still, I think I'd be willing to trade the lack of a weakness for just a deck that sets up much more consistently. So it hurts to say, but I think I almost might downvote Duraludon VMAX. I actually do like a lot of stuff about this card, but there's just not enough decks that are reliant on special energy to warrant playing this, I think, for the moment. Next up, for our final dragon Pokemon we're going to be talking about today, we are going to be looking at Regidrago. So it's going to be a basic Pokemon, 130 HP, has two different attacks. The first one, 2 colors for a flat 30. And its second attack, more interestingly, for 2 grass and a colorist is 240, minus 20 for each damage counter on this Pokemon. So I think Regidrago here actually has the potential to be one of the best new single prize decks coming out of Evolving Skies. Not that that says too much, given the state of single prize Pokemon. But the reason I do like this is because we have Cherrim, and Cherrim can allow you to accelerate as many grass energies as you want to your non-rule box Pokemon. So being able to power up a Regidrago in one turn with a Cherrim and one manual attachment of a fire energy to do 240 is, I think, pretty solid. We can two-shot any VMAX in the game and deal with any multi-prize or single prize cards out there as well. Most of the time as well, the damage reduction isn't even going to be that bad because with 130 HP, most decks out there can one-shot your Regidrago. So I think the vast majority of the time, this is going to be swinging for a flat 240, which is pretty nice. And even though this is a multi-energy attack cost, I really don't think it's even that big of a deal. With cards like Training Court, Energy Search, Energy Retrieval, etc., or even Aurora Energy if you really want to go that route, I don't think it's going to be too difficult to actually get this thing up and running. Now, as you guys can tell by my rating, I do like this card. I am going to choose to upvote it, but I actually do have one really big concern for this deck. And as you guys can probably expect, it's going to be Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. I think a lot of the times Rapid Strike Urshifu is going to be able to just pick off your Cherrims before you get up and running. And even if they don't knock out your Cherrims, Gmax Rapid Flow actually hits for 120, which at a glance doesn't seem like anything crazy. But if your opponent really wants to, they can actually Gmax Rapid Flow onto 2 Regidragos, and now their attack does no damage at all. So they can actually kind of checkmate you in a way where they can basically render your attackers useless, and then while your attackers can't do damage, they can pick off your Cherrims on the bench safely with Gmax Rapid Flow on following turns. So I actually am kind of worried about potentially the Rapid Strike Urshifu matchup. Now, I guess you could attempt to play stuff like Scoop Up Net if you do want to attempt to tech for Rapid Strike Urshifu, but I'm really torn if you're going to be able to successfully tech for that matchup or not. So that is going to be one of the disclaimers I do want to throw out there for Regidrago. But I feel like if you can successfully dodge Rapid Strike Urshifu, being able to just knock on your opponent's door every turn doing 240 with a single prize Pokemon is going to be too much for a lot of these other multi-prize decks to deal with. And I think Regidrago could maybe still find a spot in the game. Again, so long as Rapid Strike Urshifu isn't completely dominating. Alrighty guys, next up we're going to be taking a look at a pair of Pokemon. We're going to be taking a look at Smeargle and Eldegoss. With Smeargle, I think being a little bit more of our primary focus here for this discussion. So both these Pokemon have 80 HP with a 1 retreat cost. And Smeargle here has 1 attack for 2 colorless energy. You reveal any number of basic energy from your hand, and this does 30 plus 30 more damage for each basic energy type you revealed in this way. And as you guys can imagine, the Eldegoss we're going to be taking a look at does synergize with this kind of nicely. Has this ability, you may search your deck for 2 basic energy cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So you guys can easily sort of see the archetype they're trying to push here. We want to set up a couple of these Eldegoss to flood our hand with energy. That way we can attack for a ton of damage. And if we just quickly run through the math, if we have all 9 different types of basic energy, including Fairy, we're going to cap out at 300 damage, which I know that sounds like such a lot, but guys, honestly, I don't even know if that's that great. Honestly, the difference between 300 damage and 170 damage is very minimal. And the reason I say that is 300 is just not enough to knock out any VMAXs in one hit. And if you're forced to two-shot a Pokemon VMAX, well, guess what? There's plenty of other cards in the format that can hit around the 170, 180 damage range with much more consistent strategies than this. You actually need a ton of different Pokemon, I think, in play at any given point. So ideally, you're going to want 1 to 2 Eldegoss, 1 to 2 Smeargle. You probably need Milotic on the board somewhere as well to make sure that Marnie doesn't destroy your hand. Not only do you need to play Twin Energy to be able to power up Smeargle in a turn, but because you can only have 4 Twin Energy in a deck, you need other ways of accelerating energy, which might take the form of something like Flaffy or Frostlass, or maybe something trainer-based like Turbo Patch or EXP Share. Then on top of that, because you always want to keep these basic energies in your hand, you can't really play supporters like Professor's Research or Marnie. You need to play supporters that expand your hand size, and honestly, there's just not too many great ones to build your entire deck around. And guys, I probably sound like a broken record at this point too, but these sorts of decks are just going to get destroyed by Rapid Strike Urshifu, especially one like this, which might need like 3 to 4 different types of Pokemon in play at any given point. Because you need so much with this deck to keep it held together with duct tape, essentially. And anything that can snipe or spread is really going to give, I think, this deck some trouble here. So unfortunately, I can't say I'm too excited about this combo of cards. I do think Eldegoss might have potential outside of this whole Smeargle deck. As for example, you can maybe grab Psychic Energies to accelerate with Galarian Articuno or Shadow Rider Calyrex. You can grab Fire and Grass Energies to accelerate in the Cherrim deck with Regidrago that we just talked about. I think decks like that could enable Eldegoss to maybe see some play at some point too, but even still I have some reservations there because Eldegoss is a stage 1. It's not quite as easy to just splash into your deck. So yeah, lots of reservations all around for both these cards, but if I do have to pick, Eldegoss is definitely the one I think has a little bit more long-term potential at the moment. So this definitely looks to be a fun gimmicky deck, guys, but probably not one that is going to take down any major tournaments. So for our first trainer card we're going to take a look at, we're going to check out Aroma Lady. This says, draw 2 cards, then remove all special conditions from your active Pokemon. Overall, I think this is a very, very weak supporter card. You know, we have supporters like Research that allow you to draw 7. You know, I don't think removing special conditions from your active is worth the 5 card decrease, if I'm just being honest, guys. But also, we still have other cards like Birdkeeper in the format. Birdkeeper allows you to draw 3, and by switching with Birdkeeper, you still remove special conditions. Like, yes, you might need a way to retreat back into that Pokemon if you want to keep attacking with it. But even still, I think I would rather take my chances with Birdkeeper. Most decks also are playing very heavy counts of switch right now. And so if you're already playing all these switching cards that most decks are, just keep playing your normal copies of Professor's Research instead of this weak draw 2 card. And even on top of that, we have to ask, well, are special conditions even worth preventing right now? And I think the answer is no there as well. Not really any top tier decks are focused on inflicting special conditions. This is like the definition of a bulk card that you're never going to use. Hard pass. Next up, we have Booster Shake. This is an item card that says when you use this card, your turn ends, and you search your deck for a card that evolves from one of your Pokemon and put it onto that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. You can use this card during your first turn or on a Pokemon that was put into play this turn. So we've actually seen some cards like this over the years actually find a lot of success. I think one of the big ones is going to be the supporter card Wally back from Roaring Skies, most notably alongside the item lock Trevenant. So Booster Shake, I imagine if it does see any play, would function very similarly. You want to use this to evolve turn 1 into some sort of Pokemon with a strong ability to start maybe locking your opponent in some way. But as you guys can tell by my rating, I definitely have some skepticisms about this card. The big thing that turns me off of this is how it does end your turn. And while I definitely understand why it does that, seems fair, you don't want to be able to just immediately evolve into a VMAX turn 1 and be able to start attacking. So ending your turn, I think, is fair. But the issue with this is that this means you have to play 4 copies of this if you want to find it turn 1. And the reason I am specifying turn 1 is because after turn 1, you want to be attacking. You want to start putting on pressure, start taking prizes. And if you're ending your turn with this card in the mid to late game, that's a huge tempo swing, I think, back in your opponent's favor. And if you don't find this turn 1 when you're playing 4 copies of it in your deck, well, now you have a ton of dead cards in your deck just taking up space that could have been used for much better cards. And that's really my main gripe with this thing. You know, if this card does see play, I have a feeling it'll be for control archetypes at some point that aren't as focused on taking prizes and stuff like that. Or maybe if we get some sort of stage 2 Pokemon where the basic or stage 1 can cheat in evolution, kind of like the Duskull that we're losing in Cosmic Eclipse, Booster Shake might have potential in some sort of deck kind of like that as well. But I think the fact that this card ends your turn is going to be the big thing that prevents this from seeing play. I definitely agree that this card needed something to sort of keep it in check, but I really wish they would have picked a different sort of downside or negative effect that would have allowed this card to still be decent in the later stages of the game. Next up, guys, we have the return of a classic supporter, and that is going to be Copycat. Copycat is a support that says shuffle your hand into your deck, then draw a number of cards equal to the number of cards in your opponent's hand. So while I think the vast majority of decks out there will not be using Copycat, and instead relying on old favorites like Professor's Research and Marnie, I do think there is a world where Copycat sees play. Copycat actually is a card that has seen play in some of its earlier printings, you know, a bit less during its most recent printing back in Celestial Storm. I think some of the decks that might potentially be able to abuse Copycat at some point are going to be decks where they bait your opponent into not playing many cards out of their hand. So for example, if we get some sort of item lock archetype, Copycat is a card in theory that could make some sense because your opponent is item locked. They can't play things like quick balls, metal saucers, switches, so they naturally have kind of a larger hand size, usually making your Copycat draw you a decent amount of cards. Or for example, if you are some sort of spread archetype, kind of like Noivern in this way as well, where your opponent doesn't want to bench excessive amounts of Pokemon, that might lead to inflated hand sizes, making Copycat maybe a decent inclusion as a 1-2 of. For this exact reason, I actually did play Copycat as a 1 of in a Weezing spread deck back at a 2019 regional because people didn't want to bench stuff, so they had more cards in hand, and Copycat could sometimes net me, 6-7 cards for my opponent not playing down as many Pokemon. That being said, I think generally our pool of draw supporters right now are so strong that they kind of push this out of being a good general sort of tertiary supporter and is only going to see play in these sort of limited scenarios like I'm outlining here. So I definitely welcome Copycat back to the game. Not an awful supporter by any means, but is also not going to become a staple in most decks either. Alrighty guys, next up we have Crystal Cave. This is a stadium that says, once during each player's turn, that player may heal 30 damage from each of their Metal and Dragon Pokemon. This is actually a very similar card to the old Rough Seas, which did this exact same thing for Water and Lightning Pokemon, and that was a card that did see play, so again there is some historical precedent for Crystal Cave to be good. And with Metal Pokemon still aiming to be a type that focuses a little bit more on tanking and defensive options, I definitely see a world where Crystal Cave can see some play. Now, the issue I have with Crystal Cave is that right now, I don't think very often healing 30 is going to turn a 2-shot into a 3-shot. For example, if you are a Metal Pokemon VMAX and your opponent's hitting you for like 200, well, healing 30 most of the time isn't going to change anything in that regard. Crystal Cave is really only going to make a difference if the rest of your deck is kind of focused on compounding this sort of healing and tanking strategy. And also just looking at the landscape of the early post-rotation format, I'm not seeing too many really tanking focused Metal or Dragon decks. I have seen some talk online about maybe building around a designated Zamazenta V deck and just trying to outlast all of these Pokemon VMAX now that tag teams have rotated. So that could be one instance where maybe Crystal Cave could see some play. But I'd say overall, the applications for this card short term aren't that great. But even with that being said, I still really like Crystal Cave. I don't expect them to quit printing Metal Pokemon or Dragon Pokemon VMAX anytime soon. And every time we see that, we're going to have to revisit this card. Next up, guys, we are getting some more of these glove cards that we saw get introduced in Chilling Reign. We have Digging Gloves and Rubber Gloves. So they are a Pokemon tool card that increases your damage by 30 done to either fighting or lightning Pokemon, depending on which of these cards you have attached. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about these, unfortunately, though, as the other glove cards up until now have done very little, and I don't think getting a fighting gloves or a lightning gloves is really going to change that in any meaningful way. I think you would really need a highly concentrated metagame around one of these types, and also be playing a deck that is just narrowly shy of a one-shot to really get any worth out of these cards. And I just think most of the time that situation's not really going to present itself. So for that reason, guys, I am going to pass on these. Next up, we have a new item card called Dream Ball that says you may only play this card when you draw it as a prize card before putting it into your hand. Then search your deck for a Pokemon and put it onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. So at a glance, this effect is actually really good, searching your deck for any Pokemon. And note, it does not specify basic Pokemon. So this means, as far as I understand it, Pokemon VMAX, Stage 2, Stage 1s, and just immediately put it on your bench. That's a really powerful effect. But of course, as you guys can tell, the big issue is you have to draw it as a prize card. And currently, we really don't have too many great ways at manipulating our prize cards. Yes, we do have Peonia. But guys, if we're restructuring our entire draw engine around Dream Ball and Peonia, I'd kind of argue if you just cut these cards and just played a normal, more consistent, stronger search and draw engine, you're going to be able to set up your Pokemon either way. And that's where all of my enthusiasm for Dream Ball just kind of goes away. Now, of course, this could definitely change as we get more and more sets. Like if we get an ability on maybe a basic Pokemon that can manipulate our prize cards, yeah, I might play some copies of Dream Ball. But I think 99.9% of the time, this card is going to be completely dead in your deck, especially if you are a basic Stage 1 or VMAX deck where it's already really easy to get your Pokemon in play. Yeah, don't get fooled by how good this effect is. This card is a huge trap. I don't think this is going to be very good. Next up, guys, we have the Elemental Badge that I referenced a little bit earlier in this set review. This is going to be a Pokemon tool. It says the attacks of the Pokemon that have Vaporeon V, Jolteon V, or Flareon V in their name this card is attached to costs 1 colorless less. And just for clarification, this does apply to their VMAX counterparts as well. So yeah, this is a good card. It is kind of only as good as Vaporeon, Jolteon, or Flareon, but I think all of these cards have potential to some degree or another. I think most notably Jolteon VMAX in the short term, and being able to go from 2 attachments just to a single attachment per turn is really big. And with strong search engines like Inteleon popping up in decks lately, I don't think it's going to be too hard to actually even find this on the turns that you want to as well. I think we're going to have to take this into consideration anytime we might attempt to build around any of these Gen 1 Eeveelution VMAXs. Next up, guys, we have Full Face Guard. This is another Pokemon tool. It says the Pokemon this card is attached to, except Pokemon with abilities, take 20 less damage from your opponent's Pokemon's attacks. So I think this is a tool card that is only going to have very select use. And what I mean by that is I think this will exclusively see play in VMAX decks that don't have abilities that also want to tank. Because a lot of the times if you would play this on maybe like a single or multi-prize Pokemon, the 20 damage reduction might not go far enough to actually prevent a one-shot and might wind up making a card like this kind of irrelevant otherwise. So that's why this is basically limited just to Pokemon VMAX. And even in the case of Pokemon VMAX, I don't think a 20 reduction a lot of the time is going to change a 2-shot to a 3-shot. So that means that this has to be limited to VMAX decks whose entire strategy is based around tanking. So I think maybe an example of this could be something like Copperajah VMAX. I know this is an obscure example to throw out there. It's a metal Pokemon. Metal Pokemon traditionally have lots of tanking options. We just took a look at a new stadium, of course, that could help with this as well. And Full Face Guard, in conjunction with some of these other cards, could make some sense and replace something like Big Charm in these styles of decks. Even though Big Charm is giving your Pokemon plus 30 HP, if you're forcing your opponent into 2 and 3 shots, Full Face Guard is objectively better because if they even have to attack twice into the Pokemon, that's effectively 40 more HP you would have gained as opposed to the 30 from Big Charm. So like I said, for these specific situations, Full Face Guard is an objective upgrade. Now, do I think these instances are going to pop up all the time? Not exactly, but we've seen decks play Big Charm and other damage-reducing Pokemon tool cards even very recently. So for that reason, guys, I am going to remain just smack dab in the middle on this card. It has potential, just probably not too many great short-term applications. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at a supporter called Gordy that says, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, reveal any number of energy you find there and put them into your hand, then shuffle the remaining cards back into your deck. So I think they are attempting to kind of push Gordy here as an answer for the Eldegoss Smeargle deck. However, I'm not sure that is really going to fix that deck's issues. Cards like this traditionally don't see a whole lot of play because it does mean you are foregoing playing something like Professor's Research, Marnie, or Boss's Orders. I mean, it really takes a lot to want to play a different supporter other than those. We have had a couple of cards like this see some play, like Fisherman or Sylan, but usually those cards have seen play in either much slower formats or in formats with very aggressive non-supporter based draw. But before I quit dunking on this card, I will at least point out I do like the fact that it does not specify basic energy. That is one thing that is different about Gordy compared to some of these other energy searching supporter cards we've seen over the years. This means we can still grab things like Twin Energy, Speed Lightning, Rapid Strike Energy, etc. And maybe one day that might be enough to push Gordy into the realm of seeing some sort of play. But for the moment, I'm pretty skeptical. And a lot of times when you play this card, unless you're playing a ton of energy already, you might hit only 1, 2 energy. And at that point, you should have just played Energy Search in your deck instead. So going to be a hard pass for me on Gordy. Next up, guys, we have a card called Lucky Ice Pop. This is an item that says heal 20 from your active, then flip a coin. If heads, return this card to your hand instead of discarding it. So this card is really fun. I actually really like this card because it's so reliant on coin flips. It probably won't see competitive play. But guys, you know you want to try this out with some sort of tanking deck where you have 4 of these in your deck and you just keep getting them back to your hand and infinitely healing. Like, you know, that's got to be so hilarious if you can pull it off. Now, of course, half the time these are just going to wind up being discarded and you're not going to be able to pull that off. But Man, I am really tempted to build something around this just to troll my opponent and keep infinite healing with these things. But on the topic of seeing competitive play, if we just compare this with Potion already doesn't really see play. I don't think a lot of the times healing just 20 is going to be enough to really change a 2-shot to a 3-shot for decks. And occasionally, even if you are able to get one of these back into your hand and do this again, most of the time at least, it's not going to be enough to drastically impact the game. So I'm going to pass on it, but this card just seems like a lot of fun. And if nothing else, this might be a fun card in pre-releases. Next up, we have Moon and Sun Badge, which is the next of these Eeveelution exclusive tool cards. But this one says, whenever your opponent plays a supporter from their hand, prevent all effects of that card done to the Pokemon this card is attached to if it has Espeon V or Umbreon V in its name. So just in a vacuum, I actually think this is like the debatably the strongest of these Eeveelution tool cards effects. Being able to essentially give your Umbreon VMAX Omega Barrier from Primal Groudon and prevent your opponent from playing things like Boss's Orders to bring up your Umbreons is an insane effect to have on a Pokemon tool card. But one thing that does kind of turn me off about this card is that, well, not only is Espeon VMAX pretty much trash, meaning that this is exclusively a card for Umbreon, and most of the applications for Umbreon VMAX are usually using Umbreon VMAX as a support Pokemon in addition to a number of other Pokemon V and VMAX in a deck. So if you throw this down on Umbreon VMAX, let's just say in Eternatus, well, it really doesn't matter if your opponent can't boss up Umbreon because they're going to be able to boss up Crobat V or a damaged Eternatus VMAX as an example. And as a result, this effect, while it's strong, doesn't really wind up impacting the course of the game. Now, the reason I'm not just downvoting this is because I do think there is a chance for a designated Umbreon VMAX deck to pop up. And if that's the case, and you're not playing a ton of these other multi-prize Pokemon on your field, I think this does have potential in that style of deck. Being able to attack with an Umbreon, tank a hit, then retreat, and your opponent no longer being able to play a boss unless they have like a Tool Scrapper is a line of play that is attractive to me. It's a very strong card in a vacuum, but in practice, it kind of remains to be seen if there is a use for it. Next up, we have one of my favorite trainer cards in Evolving Skies. We have Raihan. This is a supporter that says you can only play this card if one of your Pokemon was knocked out during your opponent's last turn. Choose one basic energy from your discard pile and attach it to one of your Pokemon. Search your deck for any one card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So with Rosa on the way out, I think Raihan actually makes for a really suitable replacement in a lot of the decks that were previously playing Rosa. Of course, it is unfortunate that you get one fewer card with Raihan, but you get to accelerate the energy that you grab, unlike Rosa. And the other card that you get can be anything, making it in some ways a little bit more flexible than Rosa as well. So you guys know me, I am a sucker for stage 2 decks. And this is like the absolute perfect card for stage 2 decks. Being able to grab Rare Candy or the Evolution if you already have Rare Candy in hand while accelerating energy is something I think is really attractive, especially on stage 2s that might not have very small energy costs. This could be a way of actually chaining them throughout the course of a game, much like with the Salamence that we looked at earlier in the set review. And even though I do think this most benefits single prize decks, because we have Altaria, I actually think Raihan could pop up in multi-prize decks as well, because you'd probably only play this as a 1 to 2 of if you are playing a multi-prize deck. But on the turn that you need it, hey, guess what? Just use Altaria to put it at the top of your deck and use something like an Oranguru, Crobat, etc. to draw into it. And then from there, you're having a good time. And of course, with Dragon-type Pokemon having funky attack costs, this is really one of the only ways we have right now at accelerating multiple different types of energies a little bit more consistently. So big fan of this card. I really do like this a lot. It helps decks that are my ideal playstyle the most, while also still offering some help to other decks in the format in the process. Next up, we have a new Rapid Strike tool. This is going to be Rapid Strike Scroll of the Flying Dragon. So the Rapid Strike Pokemon this card is attached to can use the attack on this card, and the attack here for a Fire and Lightning, you discard 2 energy and does 90 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. This is mainly, I think, looking to be a tool card for your Rayquaza VMAX decks out there, especially maybe even in the mirror match. This could be a way at picking off some flaffies and denying your opponent a one-shot on the following turn. I think the other argument you can make for this card is like, well, if you whiff what you need for a one-shot, you can clean up a knockout with this card, even if your opponent retreats it. But I would sort of respond to that by saying, well, instead of playing copies of this scroll, why not just double down on your core strategy to ensure that you can take one shots instead of playing these cards that are kind of banking on yourself not being able to take them. So I think just overall, this card's design is at odds with the Pokemon that they are pushing for you to use it with. Next up, we have Rescue Trolley. This is an item that says, choose up to 2 Pokemon with 90 HP or less from your discard pile, reveal them and put them into your hand. This is such a good card for decks kind of in the vein as Mad Party or other single prize decks, especially if you're also a deck like Mad Party as an example, where you're not playing basic energy. This in most cases is going to outclass Ordinary Rod. I think that's so cool, finally having a little bit more diversity for single prize decks in terms of recovery options. And while I think decks kind of like Mad Party are the ones that look to benefit the most from a card like Rescue Trolley, I think other multi-prize decks could still use this. So looking at Rayquaza VMAX, we are relying on a Flaffy evolution line that has 90 HP. So if Rapid Strike Urshifu is giving you some trouble and they are sniping those poor little Flaffies on your bench, this could be a nice recovery card to run in addition to your deck. I think a lot of decks will still just play Ordinary Rod, but now certain decks out there will have the option of a recovery card better suited to their playstyle. Kind of like what we saw a couple years ago, where some decks were playing Rescue Stretcher, other decks were playing Super Rod, and depending on your deck's playstyle, you would pick the recovery card that was most in line with your strategy. And I really do like that sort of diversity here in recovery options. So it's not a card that sees play in every deck, but it's definitely going to be better than Ordinary Rod in these select styles of decks. Next up, we have Ribbon Badge, another one of these evolution tools. This one says, if the Pokemon this card is attached to has Sylveon V in its name, when it is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, your opponent takes 1 fewer prize card. So many games are decided by your opponent just knocking out 2 Pokemon VMAX. And now, if you have this Ribbon Badge, you can maybe force your opponent into potentially an 8 or 7 prize game. So in a vacuum, on paper, this card looks really strong, but I do have some reservations. Cards like Island Challenge Amulet and Hero's Medal largely haven't seen a whole lot of play. Now, to be fair, they have some pretty heavy downsides to them, like massive HP reductions, which this Ribbon Badge does avoid. But of course, your opponent does have the option of kind of gusting around if you do set up your board in a way that gives them a lot of VMAXs to deal with. And really for me, I think the thing that makes me land a little bit more on the neutral side with this card is the fact that I don't think in the short term we're going to see a designated Sylveon VMAX deck. I think largely speaking, if Sylveon VMAX sees play, it's going to be more of a backup attacker in a sort of Rapid Strike Urshifu deck. However, I am open to the possibility that a designated Sylveon VMAX deck succeed at some point. We've seen it in the past with stuff like Rainbow Road, hits for a good weakness and kind of has the potential to maybe stand on its own. And in the context of that deck, Ribbon Badge does seem to make some sense to me. But outside of that, I think this card gets a little bit weaker. We do have to remember too, this is somewhat of a passive tool card, so it is open to your opponent using stuff like Tool Scrapper or Lipard V to get rid of it from play. I am a little bit pessimistic about it, but I'm going to give the card the benefit of the doubt, land a little bit more neutral here, because denying a prize card can be a massive swing in a game. Next up, we have a Stadium. This is going to be Shopping Mall. It says, once during each player's turn, that player may return a Pokemon tool attached to one of their Pokemon back into their hand. So this is definitely a unique effect that we don't really have too much of in the current game. And you guys might be thinking, well, why do I want to get my tool cards back to my hand? Well, I think there's actually a few reasons that you might consider something like this. So I think one of the most obvious reasons is if you have a Pokemon that's about to get knocked out and they have a good tool card on them, you can get that back into your hand, throw it down on something that's probably going to be able to tank a hit or two before getting knocked out. So easy example would be something like Air Balloon. That's a card you're going to see in a lot of decks. So again, when the Pokemon that it's attached to is getting knocked out, put it back into your hand, slap it down on something else. So I think if we are talking about Air Balloon, I think an example where Shopping Mall could be good is in something like Rapid Strike Urshifu, where you probably are playing copies of Air Balloon to give yourself a lower retreat cost, but you also might want to play Telescopic Sight in your list. And, let's say maybe you needed to retreat your Urshifu very early in the game to get it out of harm's way. And then later, you have a Telescopic Sight just sitting in your hand, but you can't throw it down. Well, with something like Shopping Mall, you can switch around those tools that you want and get the correct one down. But also there's other Pokemon tool cards that are around that you really want on very specific Pokemon. Think of something like Tool Jammer. You need that to always be on your active. And if the Pokemon that was once attached to gets damaged, well, you still want to use Tool Jammer, but you'd like it on your new active Pokemon, and Shopping Mall will help in those sorts of instances. Also, something like EXP Share, that's a card that you want on your bench, not your active. So if you are trying to chain energy with an EXP Share based deck, hey, keep picking that thing up every time it gets used and keep moving it to something else to get ready for your next attacker. I think these are really cool applications for Shopping Mall, but I think one of the things that turns me off about this is that I think a lot of decks are going to want other stadiums just in general. So I'm going to land on the neutral side when it comes to this. I really like this effect, but these sorts of situations are the exception, not the rule. But this is still a solid effect to be able to have access to in the format. Next up, we have Single Strike Scroll of the Dragon's Fang. What a card title. But this is a Pokemon tool card for single strike Pokemon, and it gives them this attack for a fighting metal, colorless 300, and you discard all energy from this Pokemon. So obviously this is being pushed alongside Duraludon VMAX, as that's really going to be one of the only decks that would ever have an attack cost with these sorts of energies. And I think I understand why you would want to play this card, because Duraludon most of the time is going to be exchanging 2-hit KOs with opposing Pokemon VMAX. So I think the idea is you exchange a 2-shot with a VMAX, you lose your first Duraludon, and then with your second Duraludon, you come in with this and just take one big one-shot with a couple of single strike energies and just win the game. But two big issues. First of all, this takes 5 energy. 5, that is a lot. You know, comparatively, if we look at Eternus VMAX, that can do 270 for 2. And when you start thinking about it that way, we're only doing like 10 damage per extra energy if we're comparing it to Eternus, which feels really awful. But the other issue, of course, is that this is basically exclusively going to be paired with Duraludon VMAX. I really don't think Duraludon VMAX is in a particularly great spot. And as a result, I mean, this card really isn't either. So as a result, guys, I have to downvote this thing. And finally, we get to the last of the Eeveelution tool cards. This is going to be Snowleaf Badge, and it says if the Pokemon this card is attached to has Leafeon V or Glaceon V in its name, it has no weakness and no retreat cost. Even though, of course, this card is limited only to Leafeon or Glaceon, I really do like both the effects that it provides here. No retreat cost in the case of Leafeon can be really good because you are attempting to play things like Galar Mine to increase your opponent's retreat cost. Basically means you're not affected by your own Galar Mine and can kind of freely move around the board if you want to. Leafeon's also weak to fire, and Victini I think does still look to be a good card in the post-rotation format. So this is going to help you with that as well, especially since that we are losing weakness card energy, and there's really not too many great ways at eliminating weakness in the early days of this new format. Glaceon V, on the other hand, also is going to be weak to Zacian V and Zamazenta V. So being able to prevent those guys from taking one-shots on your Glaceon, definitely a good utility whenever your deck is kind of based around denying KOs with your Glaceon's annoying ability and general tankiness. Now, it is important to keep in mind in regards to eliminating weakness, this is kind of a passive tool card, which means a lot of the times on your turn, you're not getting any effect. You're kind of banking on getting value out of it on your opponent's turn, which opens them up to being able to play Tool Scrapper or something to remove this tool card and still hit your Pokemon for weakness. But at this card's absolute worst, it's an air balloon for your Leafeon V or Glaceon V. Yeah, that's something I can definitely get on board with. So yeah, nothing but good things to say about Snowleaf Badge. Next up, we have Spirit Mask, which is a Pokemon tool card. If the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active spot and is damaged by an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, even if it's knocked out, your opponent chooses a card from their hand and discards it. This is probably like the best card in the set I've given a bad rating to. So what I mean by that is I think the effect of Spirit Mask is actually really good. But the issue is that we really don't have too many great control options, and that's really what is the cause of my negativity in terms of my rating that I'm giving out today. But right now, there's just not a whole lot of great application. I think Garbodor VMAX, which we already looked at, is a potential candidate. Being able to force your opponent to discard 2 is pretty decent. Or maybe you can play this with Malamar VMAX, which hasn't been the best VMAX up until now, but definitely has synergy with that sort of card as well. I think we're just really lacking the proper Pokemon to pair it with currently. So keep your eyes peeled for any disruptive cards coming out in future sets, because Spirit Mask is one that you might be forced to dust off once we get one. Next up, we have Stormy Mountains. Stadium card says once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for a basic lightning or dragon Pokemon and put it onto their bench. Then that player shuffles their deck. So obviously this is aiming to be paired alongside Rayquaza VMAX and Flaffy, which I definitely think it will. You're aiming to flood your board with a ton of Flappies and, of course, also your Rayquaza VMAX. So between this, Quick Balls, Level Balls, this definitely slots very nicely into your deck. and also gives you a decent counter to Path to the Peak for your Rayquaza decks. But even outside of that, Stormy Mountains definitely still has a shot to see play really in any Lightning or Dragon deck out there. And if you guys didn't play back during the Sun and Moon era, this is actually extremely similar to Brooklet Hill, which is a card that did almost this exact same thing, but only for water and fighting. And that's a card that saw play in a ton of different decks. And I see no reason why Stormy Mountains would be any different. And with cards like Chaotic Swell getting rotated, it makes cards like this even better too, as they can stick and play for multiple turns. It's really good. I think both short term and long term. If you're a Rayquaza player, make sure you have a couple of these on hand. Next up, we have Swap Cups. This is an item that says switch card from your hand with the top card of your deck. To be honest, I have no idea why this card was printed. Especially as long as we have Primate Wisdom Oranguru, this card is completely irrelevant because this does essentially the same thing, but as a one-time use item compared to Oranguru, which is much more easily searchable out of your deck and you can get persistent use out of every single turn. Now, I guess there is going to be a point in time when Oranguru is not going to be legal, but Swap Cups will be, so I guess I get it. But definitely until then, this card is complete trash. I don't see any reason to ever run this. Next up, guys, we have Toy Catcher. This says switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with 50 HP or less with their active Pokemon. So if you guys saw the section that I did on Lycanroc VMAX and talking about why its first attack really won't come into play too often, I basically have all of the same criticisms about Toy Catcher as well. So while it's true, you can use this card as early as turn 1 and maybe bring up something like Rowlet to easily knock it out, a lot of basics have more than 50 HP. A lot have 60 to 70, which makes Toy Catcher really limited in terms of knocking out like low HP evolving basics, other than maybe stuff in like the Mad Party deck. But also, I don't think a lot of the times the math from your attacks is going to work out in a way against Pokemon VMAX that allows you to bring them up with this card. Unlike something like Great Catcher that you could burn pretty much whenever you wanted, I think there's only going to be like 2 turns of the game where Toy Catcher is actually going to be live. So I think a lot of the times you're going to wind up just tossing this thing away with research, or it's just going to be stuck in your hand doing nothing. And I think I would rather just play Boss's Orders, guys. I don't think this card, despite being an item, is making enough of a case to be made to play this over Boss's Orders, or at least cut into your boss counts. Next up, we have Zinnia's Commitment. This is a supporter that says you must discard 2 cards from your hand in order to play this card, then draw 1 card for each of your opponent's Pokemon in play. As I've mentioned before, I think our current draw options, especially in our supporter pool, are really strong. I think most decks are fine with playing just 4 Research, 4 Marnie, and 1 to 2 Crobats, and that's really going to carry them through most of the game. But every once in a while, certain decks are looking for some sort of tertiary supporter, or maybe a discarding effect gels a little bit better with their strategy of deck instead of something like Marnie. Another reason I do like this card is because I don't think we have too many great supporters that focus on expanding our hand size. Like, yes, I know technically you do have to discard 2 cards from your hand to play this, but largely speaking, if you have a 4 or 5 card hand, you still get to hang on to the vast majority of your hand and just expand the size rather than dump it and refresh it with a new one. Or if you're a deck like Mad Party, where you kind of just want as many discarding supporters as possible, Zinnia's Commitment makes a good case to be made, I think, for these styles of decks. But that being said, I'm still going to land in the middle. I think most decks, largely speaking, are fine just playing Marnie, Research, and copies of Crobat V. And really, Zinnia doesn't do a lot to really change that, despite it being good in a couple of select archetypes out there. And for the last card of the Evolving Sky set review, guys, we're going to be checking out Treasure Energy. This is a special energy that says, while attached to a Pokemon, this card provides 1 colorless energy. When you took this card as a face-down prize card before putting it into your hand, you may attach it to one of your Pokemon instead. So unfortunately, guys, we are going to have to end our set review on kind of a sour note. I'm really not a big fan of Treasure Energy at all here. Most of my same gripes with this card are the same that I said about Dream Ball as well. Now, I know technically we can cheat an extra energy into play with this card, but to really maximize your chances of hitting this, whether it's off Peonia or just hitting it raw off the prizes, you're going to have to play probably like 4 copies of Treasure Energy. And at that point, if you're playing a deck that can make use of colorless energy, why aren't you just playing Capture Energy to begin with? Is like the 1 out of 20 games that you pull this off really worth not playing Capture Energy, which allows you to search for basics and get your board set up? Yeah, I think the answer is an obvious no. And with that, guys, we finally made it to the end of the Evolving Skies set review. Thanks so much for making it this far. I know my analytics show a lot of times a lot of people don't, so if you did get this far, thanks so much for sticking with me. And before we wrap up today, I just want to go over some of my overall thoughts on this set. You know, one of the things I think most people are excited about, including myself, is that dragon types are finally returning to the game. It kind of seemed cruel that they had gotten cut at the beginning of the Sword and Shield era. And one of them, Rayquaza VMAX, might even be the best new attacker that we're getting out of this set. So happy to have this type return into the game. And yet again, kind of tying into Rayquaza, the other big thing we're going to be getting in this set is going to be lightning support in the form of Flaffy. So Rayquaza is no doubt going to be the big card people are mainly thinking about, but now we have energy acceleration for any other future lightning types that might get printed in future sets, which is only a good thing. But with that being said, I definitely had some complaints about the set. You know, if you guys notice, just looking back through the set review, we didn't really talk about hardly any Stage 2 Pokemon. And the few cards that we are getting in this set, like Dream Ball and stuff like that, just really aren't any good. And that even kind of extends to the rest of the set. I think Evolving Skies is packed with filler. And I think that partially comes from the fact that Eeveelutions makes up a good chunk of this set. Eeveelutions definitely was a set in Japan geared much more towards collectors, and I think that's kind of evident in the quality of cards in this set. You know, we do have some really good ones coming out, like Rayquaza and Umbreon, just as an example, but there is just a ton of other mediocre cards that I think drag down the overall quality of the set. So as you can see, I'm electing to give Evolving Skies a 3 out of 5. I was kind of teeter-tottering between a 3 and a 4, but again, because of the sheer amount of filler that's in this set, I ultimately settled on a 3. So definitely not the best Sword and Shield set that we've seen so far, but we got some new archetypes coming out of here. And I don't know about you, but I'm still excited to pick up some of the cards that are coming out in this set. So those are my final thoughts on Evolving Skies. What do you guys think? Are there any cards in this set review that you think I was a little bit harsh on? Or you think there's any cards I was giving maybe a little too much credit? Definitely sound off below in the comment section. Let me know what you're thinking about some of the cards coming out in this set. And if you did enjoy today's content, of course, be sure to smack that like button, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. That way you'll stay up to date whenever my next video drops. Or alternatively, if you want to take your support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.